Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The building breathed in the darkness, its century-old bones creaking with secrets that should have stayed buried in its crumbling mortar. Every night at 3:33 a.m., the footsteps began, deliberate, measured, impossibly hollow, echoing from a floor that had been sealed and forgotten for over a decade. I should have known better than to take an apartment in the Hartwell building. The rent was too cheap for downtown, the landlord too eager to shake my hand and pocket the deposit. But after my divorce, my standards had plummeted along with my bank account, and the vintage charm of the historic district seemed like exactly the kind of fresh start I needed. The building manager, a weathered man named Kowalski with nicotine-stained fingers and perpetually bloodshot eyes, had given me the tour with the mechanical enthusiasm of someone who'd done it 1,000 times. He'd mentioned the building's age, constructed in 1887, renovated in the 70s, another update in the 90s, that had left most of the character intact. What he hadn't mentioned was the oppressive weight that seemed to press down from the floors above, or the way the hallway lights flickered whenever the wind picked up. My apartment on the second floor was spacious enough, with high ceilings and original hardwood floors that groaned under my feet. The windows faced east, letting in decent morning light that made the dust motes dance like tiny phantoms. I'd furnished it sparsely, a mattress on the floor, a small table, 2 chairs, and the bare minimum of kitchen supplies stacked in boxes I hadn't bothered to unpack completely. The first week passed uneventfully. I'd established a routine: work at the office downtown, grab dinner at the diner on 5th Street, return home to read until exhaustion overtook my restless mind. The building was quiet, populated mostly by older tenants who kept to themselves. Mrs. Chen from 2B occasionally shuffled past my door in her slippers, and I'd hear the muffled sound of her television through the thin walls. The man across the hall seemed to work nights, his door slamming shut just as I was pouring my morning coffee. It was during the second week that the footsteps began. The first time I heard them, I was lying in bed, drifting between sleep and consciousness when the sound cut through the silence like a blade. Steady, deliberate footsteps, directly above my bedroom. My eyes snapped open, heart immediately hammering against my ribs. The red digits on my alarm clock glowed 3:33 a.m. The footsteps continued for exactly 7 minutes. I knew because I counted every second, my body rigid with tension, breathing shallow and controlled. The sound was distinct, not the soft shuffle of slippers or the hard click of heels, but something in between. Something that made the hair on my arms stand on end and sent cold rivulets of sweat down my spine. When they stopped, the silence that followed was somehow worse than the noise itself. I lay awake until sunrise, my muscles aching from holding myself so still, my ears straining for any repetition of the sound. But the building had returned to its normal repertoire of settling creaks and distant plumbing groans. The next morning, I mentioned it to Kowalski when I encountered him replacing a burned-out bulb in the first-floor hallway. He paused in his work, his weathered face creasing into a frown as I described what I'd heard. The super explained that the third floor had been vacant for years, sealed off due to structural problems discovered during an inspection. The city had deemed it unsafe for occupancy, and the owner had never bothered with the expensive repairs needed to bring it up to code. He assured me that no one could possibly be living up there, suggesting that I'd probably heard pipes settling, or maybe mice in the walls. But mice didn't walk with such measured human cadence. The footsteps returned the following night. Same time, same duration, same crushing weight of dread that settled in my chest like a stone. This time I forced myself to get up, my legs trembling as I padded barefoot to the window. I pressed my face against the cool glass and craned my neck upward, trying to see into the windows of the floor above. The third-floor windows were dark, some boarded up, others covered with grime so thick they might as well have been painted black. No light flickered behind them, no shadow moved across their surface. Yet the footsteps continued directly overhead, slow and purposeful, as if someone was pacing back and forth across what should have been an empty room. By the fourth night, my nerves were frayed to the breaking point. I'd started drinking coffee late into the evening, afraid to sleep, afraid to lie defenseless in the dark, while those impossible footsteps marked time above me. My hands shook constantly now, and I'd developed a persistent twitch in my left eye that made my reflection look like a stranger. The building superintendent had grown irritated with my repeated inquiries, insisting more firmly that the third floor was absolutely, unequivocally empty. When I pressed him about getting access to check for myself, his demeanor had shifted from dismissive to almost hostile. He'd muttered something about insurance liability and walked away, leaving me standing in the lobby with my questions unanswered. Sleep deprivation was taking its toll. At work, I found myself staring blankly at my computer screen for minutes at a time, my concentration shattered. My colleagues had started avoiding me, probably put off by my haggard appearance and the way I'd jump at sudden sounds. I'd catch myself checking the time obsessively as 3:30 approached each day, my anxiety building like pressure in a sealed container. On the seventh night, something changed. The footsteps began as usual, but this time they seemed to be moving in a pattern. Not the random pacing I'd grown accustomed to, but something more deliberate. Back and forth, then a pause. 3 steps forward, 2 steps back. Another pause. It was almost like a code, a message tapped out in the rhythm of shoe leather against hollow floorboards. My skin crawled with the certainty that whatever was up there knew I was listening. The next morning, I made a decision that would have seemed insane 2 weeks earlier. I was going to find a way into that third floor, with or without Kowalski's permission. The building was old, and old buildings had secrets. Forgotten doors, service passages, ways for someone determined enough to access areas that were supposed to be sealed. I spent my lunch break exploring the building's exterior, walking around the block to study its architecture from every angle. On the side facing the alley, I discovered a rusted fire escape that extended to the third floor. Several of the rungs were missing, and the metal groaned ominously when I tested its stability, but it looked like it might support my weight. That evening, I positioned myself at my bedroom window with a pair of binoculars I'd purchased at a pawn shop. At 3:33 a.m., as the footsteps began their nightly ritual, I trained the lenses on the third floor windows. What I saw made my blood freeze in my veins. There was light up there, not the steady glow of electric bulbs, but something flickering and uneven, like candlelight or flame. It moved behind the grimy windows, casting shifting shadows that seemed to dance with malevolent purpose. And in one window, the one directly above my bedroom, I saw a silhouette. It was definitely human in shape, but something about its proportions was wrong. Too tall, too thin, with limbs that seemed to bend at impossible angles. It stood perfectly still for several seconds, and I had the horrible sensation that it was looking down at me, though I couldn't make out any features through the filthy glass. Then it began to move, and I realized with dawning horror that its movements perfectly matched the rhythm of the footsteps I'd been hearing. Step, 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 pause, turn, step, 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 pause. I dropped the binoculars, my hands shaking so violently I could barely maintain my grip. The plastic lenses hit the floor with a sharp crack that seemed to echo through the apartment like a gunshot. The footsteps stopped immediately. For a long moment, the silence stretched between us, me cowering by my window, whatever was up there frozen in its midnight dance. Then, slowly, deliberately, the footsteps resumed, but now they were moving in a different direction, toward what I realized must be the stairwell. My mind raced through possibilities, each more terrifying than the last. If it was coming down, if it could somehow bypass the sealed entrances to the third floor, then nowhere in the building was safe. I grabbed my keys and wallet with trembling fingers, not bothering to dress beyond the t-shirt and boxers I'd been sleeping in. The hallway outside my apartment was pitch black, the overhead lights having burned out weeks ago. I fumbled for the stairwell door, my bare feet silent on the cold linoleum. Behind me, I could hear something else moving through the building. Not footsteps now, but a strange scratching sound, like fingernails dragging across wood. I took the stairs 3 at a time, my heart pounding so hard I was sure it would burst. At the ground floor, I burst through the exit door and into the night air, gasping like a man who'd been drowning. The street was empty, lit by flickering street lamps that cast long, wavering shadows. I stood there in my underwear, shivering in the cold, staring up at the Hartwell building. The third-floor windows were dark again, no trace of the light I'd seen just minutes earlier. I spent the rest of the night in an all-night diner, nursing cup after cup of coffee, and trying to make sense of what I'd experienced. By morning, I'd almost convinced myself it had been a hallucination brought on by sleep deprivation and stress. Almost. But when I returned to the building to collect my belongings, Kowalski was waiting for me in the lobby. His face was pale, his usually steady hands trembling as he lit another cigarette. He told me that other tenants had been complaining about noises during the night. Scratching sounds in the walls, footsteps in the hallways, doors opening and closing on floors that should have been empty. Mrs. Chen had found her apartment door standing wide open that morning, though she swore she'd locked it before bed. Most disturbing of all, he'd finally gone up to check the sealed third floor himself, using a master key he'd claimed didn't exist. The door had been unlocked, the heavy boards that had secured it stacked neatly against the wall as if they'd been carefully removed from the inside. When he'd shined his flashlight into the abandoned hallway, he'd seen footprints in the dust, fresh footprints that seemed to hover several inches above the floor, as if whatever had made them didn't quite touch the ground. He'd sealed the door again immediately, he said, this time with industrial adhesive and steel brackets. But we both knew it wouldn't matter. Whatever was up there had found a way out before, and it would find a way out again. I packed my few belongings in silence, my hands still shaking from the previous night's encounter. As I carried the last box to my car, I glanced up one final time at the third-floor windows. In the daylight, they looked ordinary, just grimy glass reflecting the cloudy sky. But I knew that when night fell and 3:33 a.m. arrived, something would be pacing those empty rooms again, wearing grooves into floors that shouldn't exist, leaving footprints that floated above ground that had been undisturbed for a decade. I drove away without looking back, but even now, 3 months later, I still wake up at 3:33 a.m. My new apartment is on the ground floor of a modern complex, but sometimes, in that space between sleep and waking, I swear I can still hear those measured footsteps echoing from somewhere far above, patient and persistent, waiting for me to return. Story 2. Something was wrong with the mirror, and that wrongness had started to seep into every corner of my life like water through cracked foundation. The fluorescent lights above my barber chair hummed their usual electric funeral dirge, casting that sickly yellowish glow across the checkerboard linoleum that had seen 40 years of fallen hair and forgotten conversations. But now, when I looked into that familiar silver surface where I'd watched myself age from 25 to 42, something looked back with eyes that moved just a heartbeat too late. It started 3 weeks ago on a Tuesday morning that felt heavy with the kind of humidity that makes your shirt stick to your back before you've even broken a sweat. I was preparing my station for the day's first customer when I caught sight of myself in the mirror while reaching for the disinfectant spray. My hand moved to grab the bottle, but my reflection's hand lingered for just a moment, maybe half a second, before following suit. The bottle slipped from my fingers and clattered onto the marble counter, sending droplets of blue liquid spattering across the surface. My heart performed a small skip, the kind you get when you miss a step going downstairs. I stared at my reflection, waiting for it to stare back with the same confused expression, but it seemed to lag behind my emotions too, wearing a blank look while my face was already twisted with bewilderment. I convinced myself it was exhaustion. Running a one-man barbershop meant 12-hour days and muscles that ached deep into the bone. My eyes felt gritty with fatigue, and when you're that tired, your brain plays tricks. Everyone knows that. But the seed of unease had been planted, and seeds have a way of growing in the dark corners of your mind, especially when you water them with attention. The delay began to stretch. By the end of that first week, the gap had grown to nearly 2 seconds. I would scratch my beard, and my reflection would perform the same gesture moments later, like an actor who'd missed his cue. My customers didn't seem to notice anything amiss when they looked into the mirror during their cuts. But then again, they weren't studying their reflections with the obsessive intensity that had begun to consume me. Sleep became elusive. I'd lie in my narrow bed above the shop, listening to the building settle around me with its chorus of creaks and sighs, while my mind replayed every glance I'd stolen at the mirror throughout the day. The air conditioning unit outside my window would kick on with a mechanical wheeze, and I'd imagine I could hear something else in that sound. A whisper, maybe, or breathing that wasn't quite human. During the second week, I started keeping a stopwatch. The delay was measurable now, consistent, exactly 4 seconds. When I raised my hand, my reflection would begin the same motion exactly 4 seconds later. When I turned my head, the mirror me would follow with mathematical precision. But there was something else now. Something that made my mouth go dry and my palms slick with nervous sweat. Sometimes, in those 4 seconds of delay, my reflection would do something I hadn't done. The first time I noticed it, I was cleaning my straight razor after finishing with old Mr. Henderson, who came in every Thursday for the same crew cut he'd been getting since Eisenhower was president. I was wiping the blade with a towel, methodical strokes from base to tip. When I glanced up at the mirror, my reflection was holding the razor differently, not wiping it, but holding it up to the light, examining the edge with an intensity that made my spine crawl with cold fingers. I froze mid-motion, towel pressed against the blade, and watched as my reflection slowly, deliberately, brought the razor closer to its throat. Not close enough to cut, but close enough that I could see the sharp steel reflecting the overhead lights against the pale skin of its neck. Then, as if suddenly remembering its role, my reflection snapped back into synchronization, wiping the blade exactly as I was doing. The straight razor tumbled from my grip, clattering against the floor with a sound like breaking glass. My breathing came in short, sharp gasps that seemed to echo too loudly in the empty shop. Mr. Henderson had left 20 minutes ago, and I was alone with only the hum of the fluorescent lights and the sudden, overwhelming certainty that something was terribly, impossibly wrong. I told myself it was a hallucination. Stress manifests in strange ways, and running a business solo while living alone can play havoc with your perception. But the explanation felt thin, like tissue paper held up against a window, technically there, but offering no real protection against the cold reality pressing in from the other side. By the third week, the delay had stretched to nearly 30 seconds. Half a minute between my actions and my reflection's response. Half a minute during which my mirror self existed in some temporal pocket, following rules I couldn't understand. And during those 30 seconds, it was becoming more active, more intentional. I started seeing my reflection gesture when I wasn't gesturing, mouth words I wasn't speaking, make expressions that didn't match the careful neutrality I tried to maintain. It would point at things, sometimes at customers who sat unaware in the chair, sometimes at corners of the room where shadows gathered a little too thick, sometimes directly at me with an urgency that made my chest tight with panic. The worst part was the expressions. My face, but twisted with emotions I couldn't identify. Sometimes it looked terrified, eyes wide and mouth slightly open as if it were trying to scream a warning I couldn't hear. Other times it appeared angry, brows drawn down and jaw set with a determination that looked foreign on features I'd known for 4 decades. But most disturbing were the moments when it looked pleading, like it was begging me to understand something crucial, something that could save us both, if only I were smart enough to figure it out. My hands began to shake during cuts. Mrs. Rodriguez, who'd been coming to me for 15 years, mentioned that I seemed nervous. She asked if everything was okay at home, and I found myself explaining that I lived alone, had always lived alone, would probably always live alone because who could understand this kind of madness? She left a larger tip than usual and patted my shoulder with the kind of maternal concern that made my throat close up with unexpected emotion. The mirror began to occupy all my thoughts. Between customers, I would stand in front of it, timing the delay with obsessive precision. 35 seconds now, 38, 40. My reflection moved through the world like a sleepwalker, always behind, always catching up, but never quite synchronized with the reality I inhabited. And then, on a Thursday that felt heavy with approaching storm clouds, something changed. I was sweeping hair from around the chair when I glanced up and saw my reflection sweeping too, but in reverse. Where I swept from left to right, it swept from right to left. Where I bent to collect hair from corners, it stood straight and gestured frantically at the ceiling. My heart began hammering against my ribs like a caged bird, and sweat broke out across my forehead despite the air conditioning. I dropped the broom and stepped closer to the mirror, my breathing shallow and quick. My reflection dropped its broom too, but then it did something that sent ice water coursing through my veins. It pressed both palms flat against the glass from its side and began mouthing words with desperate intensity. I couldn't hear anything, but I could read lips well enough to make out what it was trying to tell me. Help me. Then, switch. Then, soon. The room felt like it was tilting, the fluorescent lights flickering in a rhythm that matched my racing pulse. I pressed my own palms against the glass, and for a moment, just a moment, I could swear I felt warmth coming from the other side, as if my reflection's hands were actually there, actually real, actually reaching for me across some impossible barrier. The delay had grown to nearly a full minute now, and in that minute, my reflection had become someone else entirely. Someone trapped, someone desperate, someone who needed my help, but could only communicate through gestures and pleading expressions that wore my face like an uncomfortable mask. The realization hit me like cold water in the face. What if I was looking at this backward? What if I wasn't watching my reflection lag behind? What if my reflection was trying to warn me about what was coming? What if those gestures weren't random movements, but desperate attempts to show me something I needed to see? I started paying attention to where my reflection pointed, following its gaze, noting when it gestured urgently at specific parts of the room. It kept returning to the same corner, the one behind and to the left of my barber chair, where the shadows seemed to gather with unusual thickness, even during the brightest part of the day. That corner had always felt cold, even in summer. Customers sometimes mentioned it, asking if I had a draft or if something was wrong with the heating. I'd always assumed it was just poor insulation in an old building, but now I began to wonder if there might be something else. My reflection continued its frantic pointing, and I finally worked up the courage to investigate. The floorboards creaked under my weight as I approached the corner, and the temperature dropped noticeably with each step. When I knelt down and pressed my ear to the wall, I could hear something that made my blood run cold. Breathing. Slow, rhythmic breathing coming from inside the wall itself. The sound was barely audible, like someone in a deep sleep, but it was definitely there. And as I listened, I began to realize that the rhythm matched my own breathing exactly, but delayed by exactly 1 minute. Understanding crashed over me like a wave of nausea. I wasn't looking at my reflection in the mirror. I was looking at myself, trapped somehow in a space that existed 1 minute behind the real world. And something else, something that breathed in the walls and cast no reflection, was getting ready to take my place in the present. The switch was coming. My reflection had been trying to warn me, trying to help me understand before it was too late. But now, as I stared into the mirror and watched myself mouth the word now with desperate urgency, I realized that perhaps it already was. The breathing in the walls grew louder, more insistent, and my reflection pressed against the glass one final time before the delay suddenly, impossibly, began to shrink. 55 seconds. 50. 45. Something was coming forward in time, and I was about to discover what had been waiting in those missing seconds all along. The last thing I saw before the world shifted around me was my own face in the mirror, no longer delayed, no longer desperate, but wearing an expression of triumph that I had never seen before and knew, with absolute certainty, was not my own. Story 3. There are roads that exist in more places than one, and some stretches of asphalt that bend through dimensions we weren't meant to cross. I learned this truth the hard way, mile by terrible mile. 20 years I'd been running the same route through the backwoods of Arkansas, hauling freight from Little Rock to Memphis and back again. 20 years of the same truck stops, the same faces behind cracked windshields, the same ribbon of cracked asphalt stretching endlessly under my headlights. The road had become part of me, every pothole and curve memorized until I could drive it half asleep. Maybe that's why it took me so long to notice when things started changing. The 15-mile stretch between Crozet and Hamburg had always been the loneliest part of my run. Nothing but pine trees pressing close to the shoulders, their branches forming a tunnel that swallowed my headlight beams. During the day, it was just another boring piece of highway. But after midnight, when the world went quiet and the CB radio picked up nothing but static from distant storms, that stretch felt different, heavier, like the darkness itself had weight. The first time I heard the whispers, I blamed it on interference from the radio tower outside El Dorado. The CB crackled with what sounded like voices speaking in some foreign language, not Spanish or French, but something older, with consonants that clicked and vowels that seemed to bend back on themselves. I fiddled with the squelch knob, trying to clear the signal, but the whispers only grew clearer as I drove deeper into that wooded tunnel. My hands started sweating against the steering wheel. The voices weren't coming from any radio station. They were too close, too intimate, like someone was sitting right beside me in the cab, breathing words directly into my ear. I reached over and switched off the CB entirely, but the whispers continued, now seeming to seep through the truck's metal walls. The speedometer needle trembled at 65, but my foot felt heavy on the accelerator. Every instinct screamed at me to punch it, to blast through those 15 miles as fast as the old Peterbilt could manage. Instead, I forced myself to maintain speed, gripping the wheel until my knuckles went white. Professional drivers don't panic. We've seen everything the road can throw at us. But I'd never seen anything like what waited at mile marker 247. The ancient wooden bridge had been there since the 1940s, a narrow span over Bayou Macon that the state kept promising to replace. 2 lanes of weathered planks that groaned under the weight of 18-wheelers, with rusted guardrails that wouldn't stop a compact car, let alone a loaded semi. I'd crossed it thousands of times without giving it a second thought. Now, as my headlights swept across those gray boards, the whispers reached a crescendo that made my teeth ache. The language, if it was a language, seemed to claw at the inside of my skull, words that my brain couldn't process, but my body understood as threats. My heart hammered against my ribs so hard I could feel it through my flannel shirt. I glanced down at the GPS mounted on my dashboard, looking for the familiar coordinates that marked the bridge's location. The screen flickered, numbers shifting like smoke. 33 to 1542N, 914718. W became 33 to 1542N, 914719W, then 914717W, the longitude jumping back and forth as if the bridge existed in multiple places simultaneously. My breath came in short gasps that fogged the windshield. I hit the defroster with a shaking hand, but the condensation seemed to form patterns, spirals and angles that hurt to look at directly. When I blinked, they were gone, leaving only clear glass and the reflection of my own pale face. The truck's tires hit the wooden planks with a hollow thunder that seemed to echo longer than it should. Beneath me, Bayou Macon stretched away into darkness, its black water reflecting nothing. No moonlight, no stars, just an emptiness that seemed to swallow light itself. The whispers grew so loud they drowned out the engine noise, a chorus of voices speaking in unison about things that made my stomach churn, even though I couldn't understand a single word. Then I was across, back on solid asphalt, and the whispers cut off like someone had thrown a switch. The sudden silence rang in my ears worse than the voices had. I checked my mirrors, half expecting to see something following me, but there was only darkness, and the red glow of my taillights fading into the trees. I told myself it was just exhaustion. 20 years of midnight runs were finally catching up with me. Maybe it was time to consider day shifts, regular hours, a normal life that didn't involve staring into an endless tunnel of darkness while strange voices whispered secrets I didn't want to know. But 3 nights later, making the same run with a load of auto parts bound for Memphis, it happened again. This time I was prepared. I had the CB turned off before I hit the tree line, and I'd checked the GPS coordinates for the bridge beforehand. 33 degree 1542N, 91 deg 4718W, burned into my memory. I would not let my mind play tricks on me. The whispers started anyway, seeping through the cab walls like smoke. They seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. voices that spoke with the authority of centuries. My skin crawled with the sensation of being watched by 1,000 unseen eyes. The trees pressed closer to the road, their branches scraping against the trailer with sounds like fingernails on metal. When I reached for the GPS, my hand was shaking so badly I could barely operate the touchscreen. The coordinates were wrong again, but not the same wrong as before. Now they read 33 dig 1542 N, 90 d 1 dig 47,016 W, placing the bridge a full mile west of where it should be. Yet there it was ahead of me. The same weathered planks and rusted guardrails exactly where they'd always been. I pressed harder on the accelerator, desperate to get through that 15-mile stretch as quickly as possible. The speedometer climbed to 70, then 75. The truck shuddered under the strain, its old engine screaming in protest, but I didn't care. I just wanted to be past that bridge, past those whispering voices that seemed to know things about me I'd never told another living soul. The wooden planks rushed beneath my tires, like the keys of some massive, discordant piano. The whispers rose to a shriek that seemed to come from inside my own head now, speaking words in that alien language that made my vision blur and my hands shake on the wheel. The GPS screen flickered through coordinates like a slot machine. 91 to 47, 15W, 91 to 47, 20W, 91 to 47, 12W. Each reading placing the bridge in a different reality. But this time, as I reached the center of the span, something new happened. The truck lurched to the left as if grabbed by an invisible hand. I fought the wheel, feeling the trailer start to jackknife, tires screaming against wet wood that hadn't been wet moments before. My headlights swept across the bayou below, and in that brief instant, I saw something that made my blood freeze in my veins. The water was gone. In its place stretched a vast pit filled with architectural impossibilities, structures that climbed upward and downward simultaneously, bridges that connected to nothing, staircases that folded back on themselves. And moving through those non-Euclidean passages were shapes that my eyes refused to process, beings that existed in too many dimensions for human perception. I wrenched the wheel hard right, feeling the trailer's rear wheels leave the bridge entirely before slamming back down on solid wood. The truck straightened out just as I reached the far side, back on blessed asphalt that existed in only one reality. The whispers died away, leaving only the sound of my own ragged breathing and the engine's steady rumble. I pulled into the first truck stop I could find, a 24-hour place called Mel's that served coffee strong enough to strip paint. My hands shook so badly I could barely hold the cup, and the waitress asked if I was feeling all right. I told her I was just tired, which was true enough, though it didn't begin to cover what I'd experienced. For 2 weeks, I took different routes, I-40 to I-55, adding 3 hours to each run, but avoiding that 15-mile stretch entirely. I told my dispatcher I was having truck trouble, needed to stick to major highways until I could get it properly diagnosed. He grumbled about the extra fuel costs, but didn't push too hard. Professional drivers know their equipment, and if I said something was wrong, something was wrong. But the freight business runs on schedules and profit margins, and eventually, I had to go back. A rush delivery to a plant in Hamburg, time-sensitive enough that the back roads were the only way to make the deadline. I found myself approaching those familiar pine trees as the clock on my dashboard ticked past midnight. This time, I was ready for war. I'd loaded up on coffee and energy drinks, cranked the radio loud enough to drown out whispers, and programmed 3 different GPS units with the bridge's coordinates. If reality wanted to shift around me, it would have to work harder than before. The whispers started right on schedule, but I was expecting them now. I gripped the wheel with both hands and kept my eyes fixed on the road ahead, refusing to look at the GPS screens or the mirrors or anything else that might show me things I didn't want to see. Professional drivers focus on what matters: the road, the load, the destination. Everything else is just distraction. But this time, the whispers were different. Instead of that alien language, I heard words I recognized, though they still sent ice water through my veins. They spoke my name over and over, in voices that sounded like everyone I'd ever known. My ex-wife, calling me the same names she'd used during our divorce. My father, expressing the disappointment he'd taken to his grave. Coworkers who'd smiled to my face while spreading rumors behind my back. My foot trembled on the accelerator. The speedometer needle wavered between 60 and 70 as my concentration broke apart under the assault of familiar voices speaking harsh truths. The trees seemed to lean inward, blocking out what little starlight filtered through the canopy, until I was driving through a tunnel of absolute darkness lit only by my headlights. The GPS screens were going crazy now, all three showing different coordinates that changed by the second. One read coordinates in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. Another placed me somewhere in the Arctic Circle. The third showed numbers that didn't correspond to any location on Earth, coordinates that existed only in mathematical abstractions. When the bridge appeared in my headlights, it looked different. The wooden planks had been replaced by metal grating that gleamed like scales, and the guardrails had grown into twisted shapes that resembled the bars of a cage more than safety barriers. The whispers rose to a roar that seemed to come from the bridge itself, as if the structure was alive and screaming. I hit the brakes without thinking, feeling the truck's momentum carry it forward onto that impossible span. The metal grating rang like church bells under my tires, each note perfectly pitched to resonate in my bones. The whispers were inside my head now, not heard but felt, vibrations that turned my thoughts into chaos. And then I understood. The bridge wasn't just crossing Bayou Macon. It was crossing between worlds, between realities, between dimensions of existence that overlapped in ways human minds weren't meant to comprehend. Every time I'd driven across it, I'd been traveling not just through space, but through the thin places where one reality bled into another. The GPS coordinates weren't wrong. They were all correct, simultaneously, marking the bridge's location in dozens of different versions of the same world. Some where the bayou ran a mile to the east, others where it had dried up centuries ago, still others where it had never existed at all. And in each reality, something was waiting, watching, whispering secrets that mortals weren't meant to know. I reached the center of the span and stopped, just stopped, right there in the middle of impossible architecture that existed in too many places at once. The engine idled as I sat there, hands frozen on the wheel, staring into the abyss that had replaced Bayou Macon. The shapes moving through those non-Euclidean depths were clearer now, beings of angles and curves that hurt to perceive directly. They climbed toward me through structures that folded space like origami, and I realized they weren't malevolent. They were curious. They had been watching travelers cross their bridge for decades, maybe centuries, trying to understand creatures that existed in only 3 dimensions. The whispers weren't threats. They were attempts at communication from entities that thought in languages of geometry and physics, trying to speak to a mind that could only process linear time and Euclidean space. They wanted to share their knowledge, to show me the true nature of reality, but human consciousness wasn't equipped to handle such revelations without shattering. I understood now why the GPS coordinates changed. The bridge existed as a nexus point, a place where multiple realities intersected and overlapped. Each time I crossed it, I was potentially entering a slightly different version of the world, one where history had unfolded just a little differently. Most of the time, the differences were too small to notice. But sometimes, I put the truck back in gear and rolled forward, crossing the rest of the bridge at a steady 25 miles per hour. The whispers followed me, but they felt different now, less threatening, more like a benediction from beings that existed beyond the boundaries of normal space and time. When I reached solid asphalt on the far side, they faded away with what almost sounded like disappointment. I've been running that route for 3 years since that night, and the whispers still come when I cross the bridge after midnight. But now I listen to them without fear, letting their alien words wash over me like a strange kind of music. Sometimes I think I'm starting to understand fragments of what they're trying to tell me, truths about the nature of reality that would sound like madness to anyone else. The GPS still shows different coordinates each time I cross, marking the bridge's location in realities that exist parallel to our own. I've learned to read the patterns, to recognize which coordinates lead to which versions of the world. Most of the time, I stick to the reality I know, the one where my ex-wife lives in Little Rock and my regular truck stops serve coffee that tastes like burnt motor oil. But sometimes, Late at night, when the loneliness gets too heavy and the road stretches endlessly ahead, I let the bridge carry me to somewhere else. Somewhere the whispers are a little clearer, and the darkness holds secrets worth knowing, and the 15-mile stretch between Crozet and Hamburg leads to destinations that don't exist on any earthly map. The road goes on forever, in more directions than most people ever realize, and sometimes, if you're brave enough or foolish enough to listen, the whispers will show you just how far it really goes. Story 4. The fluorescent lights in the elevator shaft flickered with the dying gasps of old ballasts, casting erratic shadows that danced like restless spirits across the concrete walls. Each sputter sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the building's perpetual dampness. My name is Marcus Webb, and I've been fixing elevators for 15 years. At 38, I've seen every kind of mechanical failure, every safety violation, every corner-cutting mistake that building owners think they can get away with. But standing in that shaft at 2:47 a.m., surrounded by the oppressive silence of the Meridian building, I knew something was fundamentally wrong with this place. The service call had come in around midnight. Emergency repair needed at the Meridian building downtown. Elevator stuck between floors, occupants trapped. Standard stuff, or so I thought. When I arrived, the building stood like a monolith against the starless sky, its 12 floors of darkened windows staring down at me with blank indifference. The security guard who let me in seemed nervous, constantly glancing over his shoulder and speaking in hushed tones about how the elevator had been acting up for weeks. The trapped occupants had already been evacuated through the emergency hatch by the fire department, leaving me alone with a machine that shouldn't have been malfunctioning. The elevator car hung motionless between the 9th and 10th floors, its cables taut and properly aligned. Everything looked normal from the outside. It was when I opened the control panel that my blood turned to ice water. Among the familiar array of buttons, switches, and indicator lights, there was something that shouldn't exist. An unmarked button, slightly smaller than the others, nestled between the ground floor and basement indicators. It had a different texture, smoother, almost organic feeling, and it seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The building's blueprints showed only a standard basement level used for mechanical equipment and storage. This button suggested otherwise. My hands trembled as I ran a diagnostic on the system. The elevator's computer registered 13 stops, not 12. According to the internal memory, the car had been making regular trips to this unlisted floor for months. The frequency was disturbing, sometimes multiple times per day, always during night hours, always when the building should have been empty. Sweat began to beat on my forehead despite the cool air. My heart hammered against my ribs like a caged animal desperate to escape. Every instinct screamed at me to pack up my tools and leave, to report the anomaly to building management in the morning. But curiosity, that fatal human flaw, dug its claws deep into my psyche. I pressed the button. The descent felt endless. The elevator shuddered and groaned as if protesting this journey into the building's hidden depths. The numbers on the display flickered erratically before settling on what appeared to be B2, though the digits seemed wrong somehow, slightly askew and pulsing with a faint luminescence that made my eyes water. When the doors finally slid open with a pneumatic sigh, I stepped into a nightmare wearing the mask of normalcy. The hallway before me was identical to every other floor in the Meridian building. Same beige carpet, same fluorescent lighting, same numbered office doors. But everything felt wrong, as if I were looking at a photograph that had been subtly altered. The air tasted stale and metallic, carrying an underlying sweetness that reminded me of flowers left too long in stagnant water. The first thing I noticed was the sound. Phones were ringing, not just one or two, but dozens of them, creating a cacophony of electronic shrills that seemed to emanate from every office. The sound bounced off the walls and ceiling, multiplying and distorting until it became a mechanical symphony of desperate communication attempts. But underneath the ringing, I could hear something else. The steady, rhythmic clacking of typewriter keys. My mouth went dry. Actual typewriters. In 2024. I approached the first office door, number 201, and peered through the frosted glass window. Inside, bathed in the amber glow of an ancient desk lamp, set a pristine 1970s office setup. Wood-paneled walls, orange shag carpeting, and furniture that looked like it had been lifted directly from a Mad Men set. But what made my skin crawl was the IBM Selectric typewriter in the center of the desk, its keys depressing on their own, creating line after line of text on a sheet of yellowed paper. The phone on the desk rang incessantly, its rotary design a relic from decades past. As I watched, frozen in horrified fascination, the typewriter finished its line and executed a perfect carriage return, the mechanical ding echoing through the glass like a death knell. I tried the door handle. Locked. Every office was the same. Behind each frosted glass door, I glimpsed the same temporal displacement. Desks from the Carter administration, phones that predated touch-tone technology, and those damned typewriters, all clicking away at some invisible correspondence. The papers they produced were too far away to read clearly, but I caught glimpses of repeated text, the same phrases typed over and over in endless loops. My breathing became shallow and rapid. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed with an intensity that seemed to penetrate my skull, and I realized I could feel my pulse in my temples, throbbing in sync with the mechanical symphony surrounding me. Each step I took felt heavy, as if the very air were thickening, trying to trap me in this temporal anomaly. As I ventured deeper into the hallway, I noticed other disturbing details. The water fountain bore a manufacture date of 1974. The fire extinguisher cases were designed in a style I hadn't seen since childhood visits to my father's office. Even the exit signs glowed with the soft radium luminescence that had been banned for decades due to health concerns. But it was the bulletin board near the elevator that made my blood run cold. Pinned beneath a yellowed piece of plastic, barely visible through the accumulated grime, was a newspaper clipping. The headline read, "Meridian Building Opens. City's newest commercial complex promises modern convenience." The date was September 15th, 1974, 50 years ago. My hands shook as I read the article. Everything matched the building above. Same address, same architectural description, same promise of modern office space. But according to every record I'd ever seen, the Meridian building had been constructed in 1998. I'd seen the permits myself, the certificates of occupancy, the inspection reports. The typewriters suddenly fell silent. In the absolute quiet that followed, I could hear my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. The phones continued their relentless ringing, but the absence of the typing created a vacuum that seemed to suck the air from my lungs. Then, slowly, one by one, the phones began to stop ringing. Office 201 first, then 203, 205, 207, working their way down the hall toward me. I backed toward the elevator, my shoes silent on the thick carpet, but feeling as if each step announced my presence to whatever force was systematically silencing the communication attempts. The last phone to stop ringing was directly beside me, Office 225, and in the sudden, complete silence that followed, I heard something that made my soul shrink. Footsteps. Not from one office, but from all of them. The sound of dozens of feet moving in perfect synchronization, the soft whisper of shoe leather against shag carpeting. They were getting up from their desks, all of them, and moving toward their office doors. I stabbed the elevator call button with a trembling finger, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The mechanical systems groaned to life, but the car seemed to be moving with deliberate slowness, as if savoring my terror. Behind me, I could hear the first office door rattling against its lock, then another, then all of them, creating a percussion of desperate escape attempts. Or were they trying to get out, or keep me in? The elevator doors finally opened, and I dove inside, slamming the button for the ground floor repeatedly. As the car began its ascent, I caught one final glimpse of the hallway. Every office door was open now, spilling amber light into the corridor. But the offices themselves appeared empty, their chairs pushed back from desks still warm with phantom presence. The typewriters had started again. When I reached the ground floor, I ran. I didn't stop to pack my tools, didn't bother with paperwork or explanations. I drove home through empty streets, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles went white. checking my rearview mirror every few seconds for signs of pursuit that never came. At home, I tried to research the Meridian building's history, but every official record confirmed the 1998 construction date. Building permits, architectural plans, zoning approvals, all dated 1997 and 1998. There was no evidence of an earlier structure, no mention of a 1974 opening. But I found something else that made me question everything I thought I knew about reality. In a digitized newspaper archive, buried deep in the microfilm records of the city's defunct evening paper, I discovered a small item dated October 31st, 1974. The headline read, "Meridian Building Fire Claims Unknown Number, Basement Level Sealed Pending Investigation." The article was brief, citing an electrical fire that had started in the building's lower levels during overnight hours. The basement floors had been sealed off due to structural damage, and several night shift workers were unaccounted for. The investigation was ongoing, but no further articles appeared in subsequent editions. The building had burned, the basement levels were sealed, and according to official records, the entire structure was demolished and rebuilt 24 years later. But somehow, that forgotten floor persisted. A temporal pocket where October 31st, 1974, never ended, where the night shift never got to go home, where phones ring eternally for conversations that will never be answered, and reports are typed that will never be read. I quit my job the next morning. I told my supervisor I was switching careers, cited burnout and family obligations. I never mentioned the Meridian building or what I'd found in its impossible depths. But sometimes, in the deep hours of the night when sleep eludes me, I wonder about those phantom workers, trapped in their eternal routine. I wonder if they know they're dead, or if they believe they're simply working late, waiting for morning to release them from their fluorescent-lit purgatory. And I wonder, with a terror that makes my skin crawl and my breath catch, if pressing that unmarked button was the first step in joining them. The worst part isn't the wondering, though. It's the dreams. Every night since that encounter, I dream of typing. I sit at a desk I don't recognize, in an office that smells of old coffee and forgotten ambitions, and my fingers move across keys that click with mechanical precision. I type the same report over and over, words that make no sense but feel desperately important. The phone beside me rings constantly, but I never answer it. I can't answer it, because my shift isn't over yet, and it never will be. The only mercy is that I wake up each morning in my own bed, in my own time. But as the dreams become more vivid and the memory of that basement floor grows sharper rather than dimmer with time, I've begun to wonder if waking up is really an escape, or just a brief intermission between shifts in a job I never applied for but can never quit. Sometimes I find myself driving past the Meridian building, and I swear I can see a faint glow emanating from somewhere deep below ground level, pulsing in rhythm with the typing that echoes in my dreams. I haven't pressed that button again. Yet. Story 5. The fluorescent lights above the front desk hummed their sickly tune, casting everything in that pale, institutional glow that made even healthy skin look corpse-like. It was 2:47 a.m. on another sleepless night at the roadside rest motel, and the only sounds were the distant rumble of 18-wheelers on the highway and the persistent buzz of dying electricity. That's when I first noticed the discrepancy that would unravel my grip on reality over the next 2 weeks. My name is Marcus, and I've been working the night shift at this forgotten strip of asphalt and broken dreams for 3 years now. 29 years old, no college degree, no prospects, just a guy who found his niche in the hours when most people sleep and decent folks avoid places like this. The roadside rest sits on Highway 50, somewhere between nowhere and nothing, catering to truckers, traveling salesmen, and the occasional family desperate enough to ignore our one-star reviews. The computer system showed room 13 as occupied. Red block on the screen, indicating someone had checked in. But according to every physical record I could find, the registration book, the key log, even the cleaning schedule, the room had been empty for 6 days. I stared at the monitor, my tired eyes trying to make sense of the contradiction. The timestamp showed the room had been marked as occupied at 11:43 p.m., roughly 3 hours into my shift. I hadn't checked anyone in. My heart began its first irregular rhythm of the night, a subtle acceleration that I told myself was just caffeine and exhaustion. I grabbed the master keys and decided to investigate. The walk from the front desk to room 13 felt longer than usual, my footsteps echoing off concrete that seemed to absorb sound rather than reflect it. The motel was built in the standard L shape, with room 13 positioned at the far end of the longer wing, isolated from the other occupied rooms. The door looked normal enough, same faded green paint, same tarnished brass numbers that matched every other room. But something felt wrong about the space around it, like the air was denser, more resistant to movement. I pressed my ear against the door and heard nothing. Absolute silence. Not even the hum of the air conditioning unit that should have been running. I knocked softly and announced myself as hotel staff, following protocol. No response. Using the master key, I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The room was empty. Bed made, carpet vacuumed, bathroom spotless. Everything exactly as it should be in an unoccupied room. Yet the computer still showed it as occupied, and now that I was inside, I could smell something. Not cleaning products or the usual mustiness of cheap motels, but something else. Something organic and slightly sweet, like flowers left too long in stagnant water. I checked the system again when I returned to the desk. Still occupied. I manually changed the status to vacant, watching the red block turn green on my screen. Problem solved, I thought. Computer glitch. These things happened in a place where the technology was older than some of the stains on the carpet. But at 3:15 a.m., the room showed as occupied again. This time, I didn't go check immediately. Instead, I pulled up the security camera feeds on the second monitor. The roadside rest had 4 exterior cameras, one covering the parking lot, one on each end of the building, and one focused on the front desk area. Room 13 fell within the range of the camera monitoring the east wing. I rewound the footage to 11:43 p.m., the timestamp when the room first showed as occupied. The image quality was poor, everything rendered in grainy black and white that made shadows look solid, and solid objects seemed to waver. For several minutes, I saw nothing unusual. Just empty concrete and the occasional truck passing on the highway, headlights sweeping briefly across the camera's field of view. Then I saw her. At 11:42 p.m., a figure approached room 13. The timestamp was accurate. This was exactly when the system registered the room as occupied. But something was wrong with the image. The figure appeared translucent, like she was made of smoke or fog given roughly human shape. She carried 2 suitcases, one in each hand, and moved with purpose directly to the door of room 13. I watched her reach toward the door, though I couldn't see if she actually used a key. The door opened. She disappeared inside, and exactly 1 minute later, the computer system marked the room as occupied. My mouth went dry. I replayed the footage 3 times, each viewing confirming what I'd seen while simultaneously making it seem more impossible. The figure was definitely there, definitely moving with intention, but she was wrong somehow. Too translucent, too smooth in her movements, lacking the small imperfections that make human motion natural. I fast-forwarded to 6 a.m., when the day shift arrived, and the room mysteriously showed as vacant again. At 5:58 a.m., the same translucent figure emerged from room 13, still carrying her 2 suitcases. She walked toward the camera, growing larger in the frame, and for a brief moment I could make out features. Middle-aged, wearing what looked like a business suit, dark hair pulled back severely. Then she moved beyond the camera's range and vanished. The next night she returned at exactly 11:43 p.m. By the 4th night, I had established a pattern. The figure, I had started thinking of her as the guest, arrived every night at the same time, stayed in room 13 until just before 6 a.m., and somehow triggered the computer system to register her presence. I began taking notes, documenting every detail I could observe through the security footage. That's when I noticed she was changing. On the first night, she had been barely visible, more suggestion than substance. By the fourth night, she appeared more solid, more defined. The grainy security footage couldn't hide the fact that she was becoming increasingly opaque. Her movements, too, were growing more natural, less ethereal. She no longer glided toward room 13, but walked with recognizable human gait. My sleep during the day became fractured and useless. I would lie in my apartment, staring at the ceiling, replaying the footage in my mind. The rational part of my brain insisted there had to be an explanation. Camera malfunction, software glitch, maybe even an elaborate prank. But the visceral part of me, the part that controlled my racing heartbeat and the cold sweat that dampened my shirts, knew I was witnessing something impossible. I considered telling my supervisor, Bob, about the situation. But how do you explain to a man who considers the highlight of his week to be Wednesday's early bird special at Denny's that you're being visited by a ghost who's apparently learning how to become human? I imagined that conversation and decided to keep investigating on my own. On the seventh night, I stationed myself in the parking lot with a flashlight and a camera, positioning myself where I could observe room 13 directly rather than through the security system. The October air was sharp against my skin, and every small sound, the rustle of wind through the dying trees that bordered the property, the distant hum of the highway, the occasional settling noise from the building itself, seemed amplified and threatening. At 11:43 p.m. she appeared, but this time I could see her with my own eyes, not filtered through grainy security footage. She was more solid than ever, though still not entirely opaque. I could see through her to the concrete wall behind, but just barely. Her business suit was dark blue, her hair auburn, her face carrying the tight expression of someone perpetually late for important meetings. She walked directly to room 13, and I watched her reach into a purse I hadn't noticed before and produce what looked like a room key. A real key, not the electronic cards we used. She inserted it into the lock, turned it, and entered the room. The sound of the door closing echoed across the parking lot with unnatural clarity. I sat in my car until dawn, watching for her to emerge, but at 5:58 a.m. she simply wasn't there anymore. One moment the room was occupied according to my computer, the next it showed vacant. I never saw her leave. By the 10th night, my hands shook constantly. I had lost 12 pounds, existing primarily on coffee and the stale sandwiches from the vending machine. Sleep came in fragments, always interrupted by dreams where translucent figures carried luggage through endless corridors of identical motel rooms. The guest was now solid enough that she cast a shadow. I watched through the security camera as she approached room 13, her movements completely natural now, completely human. The only indication that she remained supernatural was the fact that she appeared on the footage without having entered the parking lot from any visible direction. She was simply there, as if she had materialized at the edge of the camera's range. But tonight was different. Tonight, she paused at the door of room 13 and turned toward the camera. Turned toward me, though she couldn't possibly know I was watching. Her face filled the grainy frame, and despite the poor image quality, I could see her eyes clearly. Dark eyes that held an intelligence and awareness that made my blood turn to ice. She was looking directly at me through the camera. I jerked back from the monitor as if it had shocked me, my chair rolling across the floor behind the front desk. When I looked back at the screen, she had entered room 13 and the door had closed. The computer dutifully marked the room as occupied. For the first time since this had started, I called the room directly. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. On the 4th ring, someone answered. "Hello?" The voice was female, professional, slightly impatient. I hung up immediately, my hands trembling so violently I could barely replace the receiver. She had answered. The translucent figure carrying suitcases had answered the phone in room 13. The next 3 nights were a blur of sleepless terror and obsessive note-taking. The guest continued to solidify, becoming more real with each passing evening. By the 13th night, I had been unconsciously counting, and the significance of that number felt like another cruel joke from whatever force was orchestrating this nightmare. She appeared completely solid, completely human. She looked like any other business traveler who might check into a roadside motel. Professional attire, sensible shoes, the slightly frayed appearance of someone who spent too much time in airports and rental cars. If I had encountered her during normal circumstances, I wouldn't have given her a second glance. But these weren't normal circumstances, and I knew with absolute certainty that she wasn't human. At 2:30 a.m. on that 13th night, she walked out of room 13 and approached the front desk. I heard her footsteps on the concrete, steady and purposeful. The sound of the front door opening triggered the electronic chime that announced arriving guests. My entire body was rigid with terror as she approached the counter where I sat, my heart hammering so hard I could hear it in my ears. She looked exactly as she had on the security footage, but seeing her in person revealed details the cameras couldn't capture. Her skin had a waxy quality, like she was wearing too much foundation. Her eyes, though they tracked and focused normally, held no warmth, no life. She smelled like that organic sweetness I had detected in room 13. Stronger now, more cloying. She set her 2 suitcases down beside the counter and looked at me with those dead eyes. "I'd like to check in," she said, her voice the same professional tone I had heard on the phone. "Room 13, please." I couldn't speak. My throat had closed completely, and when I tried to swallow, nothing happened. She waited patiently while I struggled to find my voice, her expression never changing from that mask of businesslike pleasantness. Finally, I managed to croak out a response, telling her that room 13 was already occupied according to our system. She smiled then, a horrible stretching of lips that revealed teeth too white and too perfect. She explained that the room was hers, had always been hers, and that she had been staying there for quite some time. The system, she assured me, was correct. She had checked in weeks ago and had been a model guest, never causing any trouble, never making any noise. As she spoke, I realized with growing horror that she was right. Not about the facts. I knew she was lying about checking in through normal means, but about the deeper truth. Room 13 was hers. Had been hers since that first night I had noticed the discrepancy. Maybe longer. She had been using those 2 weeks to become real, to solidify herself enough to exist in our world. And now that the process was complete, she was making her presence official. I found myself reaching for the registration book, my hands moving independently of my conscious will. She provided a name, Patricia Hensley, and an address in a city I had never heard of. Her driver's license, when she presented it, looked authentic except for the photo, which showed the same waxy skin and lifeless eyes I was looking at across the counter. I completed the check-in process like I was watching myself from outside my body. She paid in cash, exact change, bills that felt real but somehow wrong in my hands. I gave her a key to room 13, though we both knew she didn't need it. She thanked me for my assistance and picked up her suitcases. As she walked toward the door, she paused and turned back to me. "I appreciate your discretion regarding my unusual hours," she said. "I prefer to keep a low profile." Then she was gone, walking back to room 13 where she belonged. I quit the next morning, walking out when Bob arrived for the day shift without offering explanation or working my required notice. I drove straight home, packed my own suitcases, and left town that afternoon. But sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I wonder if Patricia Hensley is still there in room 13. I wonder if she was the first, or if other translucent figures are learning to become solid in the other rooms of the roadside rest motel. I wonder what they want, where they come from, and what happens when places like that become doorways for things that shouldn't exist. Most of all, I wonder if my 2 weeks of watching her solidify was really her learning to become human, or if it was me learning to see what had always been there, waiting patiently in the spaces between our world and whatever lies beyond it. I never found out what was in her suitcases, and I never want to know. Story 6. The static electricity in the air that morning should have been my first warning. It clung to my skin like invisible fingers, making every hair on my arm stand at attention as I walked through the cramped auction house. The fluorescent lights above flickered with an irregular rhythm that set my teeth on edge, casting sickly shadows that seemed to move independently of the objects they belonged to. My name is Marcus, and 45 years of professional photography had taught me to trust my instincts about light, shadow, and the spaces between them. But that morning, surrounded by dusty antiques and the musty smell of forgotten memories. Every instinct I possessed screamed that something was fundamentally wrong with the world. The Leica 3F sat on a folding table near the back, its chrome body tarnished with age, but still elegant in its mechanical precision. The auctioneer had barely mentioned it. Lot 247, vintage camera, sold as is. But something about its presence pulled at me with an almost magnetic force. My palms grew damp as I approached it, and I noticed that the few other bidders seemed to unconsciously avoid that particular corner of the room. When I picked up the camera to examine it, a jolt of static electricity shot through my fingers, sharp enough to make me gasp. The sensation lingered, a tingling that spread up my arms like ice water in my veins. The viewfinder felt unnaturally cold against my eye, and through it, the auction house appeared somehow different, darker, with shadows that fell at impossible angles. I should have walked away then. Instead, I found myself raising my paddle when the bidding began, my hand moving with a will of its own. $25, $30, $45. Each bid sent another wave of that strange electricity through my body, until finally the gavel fell and the camera was mine. The drive home passed in a blur of unease. Every red light seemed to last an eternity, and I kept glancing at the rearview mirror, convinced that someone was following me despite the empty road behind. The camera sat in its worn leather case on the passenger seat, and I swear I could feel it watching me, even through the closed bag. That evening I loaded a roll of black and white film, Tri-X 400, my go-to stock for decades, and decided to test the camera's capabilities. I spent 2 hours wandering through the neighborhood, photographing familiar scenes, the old oak tree at the corner of 5th and Main, the abandoned gas station with its rusted pumps, the small park where evening joggers traced their usual paths. The camera felt perfectly balanced in my hands, its mechanical precision a joy to work with. Each click of the shutter was crisp and definitive, and I found myself relaxing into the familiar rhythm of composition and exposure. By the time I returned home, I had convinced myself that my earlier apprehension had been nothing more than the jitters that came with acquiring new equipment. The dark room in my basement had been my sanctuary for 20 years. Red light bathed everything in warmth, and the familiar chemical smells of developer and fixer usually calmed my nerves. But as I prepared to process the film from the Leica, that strange electricity returned, making my hands shake as I removed the canister from the camera. The developing process proceeded normally at first. I could see the images emerging on the film strip as expected. The oak tree, the gas station, the park. But as the pictures came into sharper focus, my breathing began to quicken. There were figures in the photographs that hadn't been there when I took them. In the shot of the oak tree, a woman in a long coat stood beneath its branches. Her face turned directly toward the camera. Her expression was one of desperate pleading, her mouth open as if she were screaming, though I had heard nothing when I clicked the shutter. Most disturbing of all, she held a small cardboard sign in her hands, though the text was too small to read in the negative. My heart began to pound as I examined the other frames. The abandoned gas station now showed a man in coveralls standing beside the rusted pumps, his eyes wide with terror, also holding a sign. In the park photo, 3 people stood motionless among the joggers I remembered seeing. An elderly man, a young woman, and someone whose gender I couldn't determine, all facing the camera with those same expressions of desperate supplication. I had to sit down. The dark room felt suddenly suffocating, the red light now oppressive rather than comforting. Sweat beaded on my forehead as I tried to rationalize what I was seeing. Double exposure? Impossible. The figures were perfectly integrated into the scenes, their shadows falling correctly, their positions natural within the environment. Film defect? The images were too crisp, too detailed for that explanation. With trembling hands, I made contact prints of the entire roll. Under the enlarger's harsh light, the details became even more disturbing. The signs the figures held bore dates and coordinates, written in a shaky hand that suggested urgency or fear. The woman beneath the oak tree's sign read, May 29th, 2025, 4071 28 Giran, 74 060 W. Today's date. Manhattan coordinates. The man at the gas station held a sign with tomorrow's date and coordinates that I recognized as somewhere in New Jersey. The three figures in the park each held different dates, all within the next week, all with specific geographic locations. I stumbled upstairs, my legs unsteady beneath me. The house felt different now. Too quiet, too empty. Every creak of the settling wood made me jump, and I found myself checking the locks on the doors and windows multiple times. The camera sat on my kitchen table where I'd left it, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it was somehow watching me. Sleep was impossible that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those pleading faces, their mouths open in silent screams. I kept getting up to check on the camera, half expecting to find it had moved on its own, but it remained exactly where I had left it, innocent and inanimate in the morning light. The next day, I tried to focus on my regular work, a wedding shoot that required my full attention, but my concentration kept slipping. During quiet moments, I found myself thinking about the coordinates from the photographs. The Manhattan location nagged at me particularly, and finally, during my lunch break, I looked it up online. It was the address of a building that had collapsed 2 days ago. A construction accident. No fatalities, according to the news reports, but several people had been hospitalized. I stared at the screen for a long time, my coffee growing cold in my hands. The date on the woman's sign had been yesterday, 1 day after the accident occurred. That evening, despite every rational part of my mind screaming against it, I loaded another roll of film into the Leica. I told myself I needed to understand what was happening, that there had to be a logical explanation. But as I walked through the streets, camera in hand, my body knew better. My heart rate never dropped below a racing pace, and cold sweat made my shirt cling uncomfortably to my back. I photographed different locations this time: the library, the coffee shop on Elm Street, the old cemetery at the edge of town. Each click of the shutter sent a small shock through my fingers, and I began to notice that the world looked slightly different through the viewfinder. Colors seemed muted, shadows appeared deeper, and there was always movement at the edge of my vision that disappeared when I looked directly at it. Back in the darkroom, my hands shook so badly I could barely load the film onto the developing reel. The chemical smells that had once been comforting now made me nauseous, and the red light felt like being trapped inside a beating heart. The new photographs were worse. Many more figures this time, scattered throughout each image like a crowd of the desperate. They all faced the camera directly, all held signs with dates and coordinates, and all wore expressions of such raw terror that looking at them made my chest tighten with sympathetic panic. But it was the dates that truly chilled me. They progressed chronologically, starting with tomorrow and extending through the next month. The coordinates covered locations across the country. Some I recognized, others I didn't. I wrote them all down with a shaking hand, my neat photographer's penmanship deteriorating into barely legible scrawls. Over the following days, I began checking news reports obsessively, cross-referencing them with the coordinates and dates from the photographs. The pattern became undeniable. A bridge collapse in Oregon matched coordinates from one of the signs, occurring exactly on the predicted date. A gas explosion in Texas, a sinkhole in Florida. Each disaster corresponded precisely to the information held by the figures in my photographs. The camera had somehow captured people who would be affected by future events, not casualties, but witnesses, survivors, people whose lives would be forever changed by things that hadn't yet happened. They were reaching through time, trying to warn someone, anyone, of what was coming. But the most disturbing realization came when I started looking more closely at the figures themselves. Some of them looked familiar. The elderly man from the park. I was certain I had seen him somewhere before. The young woman. Her face nagged at me with the persistence of a half-remembered dream. It was while flipping through old photo albums that I found them. The elderly man was Mr. Henderson, who had run the corner store until it closed 3 years ago. The young woman was Sarah Chen, a local artist whose work I had photographed for a gallery opening. Both had been dead for over a year. The knowledge hit me like a physical blow, driving me to my knees in the middle of my living room. My vision blurred, and for a moment I thought I might pass out. The figures in the photographs weren't trying to warn about future disasters. They were showing me where they had been trapped, caught between moments, between one reality and another. The camera wasn't just capturing images, it was capturing souls. That night, I made a decision that terrified me almost as much as the photographs themselves. I loaded one final roll of film, but this time I pointed the camera at myself. Standing in front of my bathroom mirror, hands trembling so violently I could barely hold the Leica steady, I took a self-portrait. The flash seemed brighter than it should have been, and for just a moment, I thought I saw other faces reflected in the mirror behind me. All the people from the previous photographs, watching with those same pleading expressions. Developing this final image took every ounce of courage I possessed. As the photograph emerged in the developer, I saw myself staring back from the paper, but I wasn't alone. Standing behind me, translucent but clearly visible, were dozens of figures. They filled the frame, stretching back into impossible depths, all holding signs, all facing the camera with expressions of desperate hope. And in my own hands, reflected in the mirror, I held a sign of my own. The date was 6 months in the future. The coordinates were my exact location, my house, my darkroom, the place where I stood at that very moment. I understood then that the camera had chosen me, just as it had chosen all the others. We were all trapped in the space between moments, between what was and what would be, forced to watch as time unfolded around us while we remained frozen in our singular instances of terror and realization. The camera sits on my desk now as I write this. I've tried to destroy it, smashing it with a hammer, burning it, even burying it in the woods behind my house. But it always returns, sitting exactly where it was before, unmarked and patient, waiting for the next roll of film, waiting for the next moment to capture and hold forever. I don't take photographs anymore. Can't risk adding anyone else to that collection of trapped souls. But sometimes, in the corner of my vision, I catch glimpses of other photographers, other cameras, other moments of realization. The network is growing, spreading, one captured instant at a time. The date on my sign approaches with each passing day, and I find myself checking the calendar obsessively, counting down to my own moment of permanence. When it comes, I know I'll be ready. I'll be holding my own sign, warning whoever comes after me, adding my voice to the chorus of the trapped and the desperate. But until then, I wait, and I watch, and I remember that not all photographs capture moments in time. Some create them, freeze them, and hold them forever in the space between the click of the shutter and the fall of light onto film. The camera sees all. The camera keeps all. And once it has seen you, you can never truly leave. Story 7. The dead don't rest. They rearrange. The first thing you notice about working night security at Willowbrook Cemetery isn't the silence. It's how the silence moves. It shifts between the headstones like something alive, pooling in the older sections where the marble has blackened with age, then spilling over into the newer plots where the granite still gleams under the pale streetlights. After 3 months on this job, I thought I'd gotten used to it. I was wrong. My name is Marcus Reed, and I'm 52 years old. I've worked security for most of my adult life. Shopping malls, office buildings, construction sites, places where the worst thing you might encounter is a drunk teenager or a vagrant looking for shelter. But when the company offered me this position at Willowbrook, I took it without hesitation. Better pay, fewer people to deal with, and how much trouble could dead folks cause? The cemetery spans 47 acres of rolling hills just outside the city limits. Established in 1847, it holds the remains of Civil War soldiers, prominent local families, and thousands of ordinary people who lived and died in this corner of Pennsylvania. The older sections spread across the western hills, where weathered stones lean at odd angles and moss covers names that time has tried to erase. The newer sections occupy the eastern slopes, organized in neat rows that make my nightly rounds more efficient. My shift runs from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. 8 hours of walking predetermined routes, checking gates, and ensuring nobody disturbs the peace. The routine became second nature quickly. Start at the main entrance, work clockwise through sections A through M, then counterclockwise back to the office. 2 complete circuits per night, with hourly radio check-ins to the monitoring service. It was during my 4th week that I first noticed something off. I was completing my second round, maybe 2:30 in the morning, when I passed through Section G, one of the older areas where the headstones date back to the 1890s. I'd walked this same path hundreds of times already, knew every crack in the pavement, every tree that cast shadows across the narrow cemetery roads. But something felt different. Not wrong, exactly, just shifted. I stopped walking and swept my flashlight beam across the familiar landscape. The yellow circle of light passed over rows of granite and marble monuments, some topped with angels or crosses, others simple slabs marking where people had chosen to rest forever. Everything looked normal, yet the feeling persisted, like walking into a room and sensing someone had moved the furniture while you were away. My heart rate picked up slightly, that low-level alert that comes from years of security work. I spent an extra 10 minutes in that section, checking between headstones, looking for signs of vandalism or disturbance. Finding nothing unusual, I continued my route, but the uneasiness lingered like smoke in my lungs. 3 nights later, the feeling returned in the same spot. This time, I was certain something had changed. I pulled out my phone and took several photographs of the area, though I couldn't have explained why if anyone had asked. The pictures showed nothing but weathered stone markers arranged in their eternal rows, but I saved them anyway. Over the following weeks, the sensation of wrongness grew stronger. It wasn't limited to Section G anymore. I began feeling it in other older areas, particularly sections D, H, and K. My chest would tighten whenever I approached these zones, and my breathing would become shallow and rapid. I started timing my routes more carefully, noting exactly when and where these episodes occurred. The breakthrough came during my 7th week on the job. I was reviewing the photographs I'd been taking, comparing images of the same areas shot on different nights when I noticed it. Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell's headstone, a modest gray granite marker from 1923, had definitely moved. Not fallen or tilted, but shifted approximately 3 inches to the northeast, from where it had been positioned 5 days earlier. My hands began to shake as I scrolled through more photos, cross-referencing locations and dates. Thomas McKenna's elaborate Victorian monument had moved 4 inches southwest. Sarah Chen's simple stone had crept 2 inches due north. The movements were subtle, easily dismissed as tricks of perception or photography angles, but once I started looking, the pattern became undeniable. I spent the next several nights focused on documentation rather than routine patrol. Armed with a measuring tape, notebook, and camera, I began mapping the positions of every headstone in the affected sections. The work was methodical and exhausting, requiring me to crawl between graves, measure distances to fixed reference points, and record precise coordinates for each marker. The results made my mouth go dry and my palms slick with cold sweat. Over the course of 2 weeks, 37 headstones had moved. Not random shifts caused by settling ground or frost heave, but deliberate repositioning. When I plotted their new locations on paper, connecting the stones with pencil lines based on their movement patterns, shapes began to emerge. Angular symbols that looked almost like letters from an alphabet I didn't recognize. Sleep became elusive. During my days off, I found myself researching cemetery maintenance practices, geological surveys, anything that might explain what I was witnessing. But the more I learned about soil composition and foundation settling, the more convinced I became that natural causes couldn't account for the precision of these movements. I began taking measurements multiple times per shift, checking the same stones at the beginning and end of each route. The movements were always small, never more than 6 inches in a single night, but they were consistent, and they were always in the same direction relative to the emerging patterns. My supervisor noticed my increased attention to the older sections during one of his surprise visits. He mentioned that I seemed more thorough than previous guards, spending extra time in areas that rarely saw visitor activity. I told him I'd noticed some settling issues that might need attention from the grounds crew, which seemed to satisfy his curiosity. But privately, I was becoming obsessed. I printed maps of the cemetery and covered them with measurements, drawings, and photographs. My kitchen table disappeared under layers of documentation that I pored over during daylight hours when I should have been sleeping. The symbols were becoming clearer as more stones moved into position. During my 10th week, I made a discovery that sent ice water through my veins. While researching the symbols online, I found references in several academic papers about comparative religion and occult archaeology. The shapes matched illustrations from medieval grimoires, ancient texts dealing with supernatural practices and dimensional theory. One symbol in particular, formed by 7 headstones in Section D, corresponded exactly to a diagram labeled as a threshold marker in a digitized manuscript from a monastery in Romania. The accompanying text, translated from Latin, described it as a focal point for passages between realms of existence. My hands trembled so violently while reading that I had to put down my phone. The cemetery suddenly felt different when I returned for my next shift. Every shadow seemed deeper, every sound more significant. The silence that had once felt empty now felt full, pregnant with possibilities I didn't want to consider. I started carrying a small digital recorder during my rounds, documenting not just visual changes, but any unusual sounds or sensations. Reviewing the audio later, I discovered low-frequency humming that I hadn't consciously heard while walking. The sound was strongest near the areas where the symbols were forming. The other symbols were taking shape more rapidly now. In Section K, 6 headstones had arranged themselves into what my research suggested was called a viewing aperture, supposedly allowing observation across dimensional boundaries. Section H was developing what appeared to be a summoning focus, though summoning what, the text didn't specify. My appetite disappeared. Food tasted like cardboard, and my stomach remained knotted with constant tension. I lost 15 pounds in 3 weeks. My reflection in the security office mirror showed hollow cheeks and dark circles that made me look like I belonged among the cemetery's permanent residents. During week 12, the symbols reached completion. 7 distinct formations spread across the older sections, each comprised of multiple headstones that had moved with impossible precision into perfect geometric arrangements. Standing in the center of the cemetery during my midnight rounds, I could see them all. Ancient symbols carved not in stone, but formed by the stones themselves. That's when the dreams started. Even calling them dreams feels wrong, because I experienced them while wide awake during my patrol routes. Sudden visions of the cemetery from perspectives I'd never held. Aerial views, underground angles, glimpses of the grounds from decades or centuries in the past. I would blink and find myself seeing the same familiar landscape populated by people in old-fashioned clothing, their faces always turned away from me. During one of these episodes, I realized I was watching the cemetery's construction in 1847. Workers were carefully positioning the first headstones, according to instructions from a man in a long black coat, who consulted repeatedly with a leather-bound book. The placement wasn't random, it was intentional, part of a design that would only become apparent once enough graves had been filled and enough time had passed for the stones to complete their slow migration. The realization hit me with physical force, doubling me over with nausea. Willowbrook Cemetery wasn't just a burial ground, it was a machine. A massive, slow-operating device designed to open doorways using the movement of markers over decades or centuries. And now, after nearly 200 years, it was finally ready to function. I spent my last night at Willowbrook documenting everything I could. Photographs, measurements, audio recordings, detailed sketches of each symbol formation. As dawn approached, I could feel the air itself changing, becoming thicker, more electric, charged with potential energy that made my skin prickle. Standing in the cemetery's center as the first rays of sunlight touched the eastern headstones, I watched shadows fall across the completed symbols in ways that seemed to bend light rather than simply block it. The shadows were darker than they should be, and within that darkness, movement flickered, shapes and suggestions of forms that didn't belong to our world. I submitted my resignation that morning, effective immediately. My supervisor seemed relieved rather than concerned, mentioning that the position had seen unusual turnover in recent years. When I asked about previous guards, he grew vague, saying only that they'd found other opportunities or decided the work wasn't suitable for them. I've spent the months since trying to return to normal life, but normal feels like a concept from someone else's existence. I work days now, in a shopping mall where the only mysteries involve teenagers shoplifting or elderly customers getting lost between stores. Safe, mundane problems with simple solutions. But sometimes, driving past cemeteries, or even seeing headstones in movies, I feel that familiar tightness in my chest and the rapid, shallow breathing that means something is fundamentally wrong with the world. I know that somewhere, other burial grounds might be completing their own slow transformations, other symbols forming as stone markers creep across the ground with patient, inexorable purpose. I never reported what I discovered at Willowbrook. Who would believe it? More importantly, what if someone did believe it and decided to investigate? Some doors once opened can never close again. Some knowledge once released spreads like infection. The dead don't rest, and they're not finished rearranging themselves. Somewhere tonight, in cemeteries across the country, headstones are moving, symbols are forming, and the barriers between worlds grow thinner with each passing hour. I just pray I'll never have to see what comes through when they finally complete their work. Story 8. The blueprints never lie. In 37 years of life and 15 years as an architect, I had built my entire existence on this fundamental truth. Plans were sacred documents, precise representations of reality carved in ink and measurements. So when I first noticed the discrepancy in apartment 4B, my hands began to shake before my mind could even process what I was seeing. The cramped studio I'd rented on the 4th floor of the Meridian building was supposed to be my fresh start after the divorce. Simple, affordable, anonymous. But as I stood in the center of the main room, architectural plans spread across the scarred wooden floor. My professional eye caught something that made my chest tighten with inexplicable dread. According to the building's original blueprints, there should have been a doorway in the eastern wall, leading to what appeared to be an identical unit. Instead, I faced an unbroken expanse of yellowed drywall. The first night, I convinced myself it was a simple renovation oversight. Buildings get modified, walls get moved, doors get sealed. It happens all the time. But sleep eluded me as I lay on my mattress, staring at that wall in the darkness, feeling an irrational certainty that something was watching me from the other side. My skin prickled with goosebumps that had nothing to do with the apartment's perpetual chill. The heating system wheezed and rattled through the night, but the cold seemed to emanate specifically from that eastern wall, as if it were drawing warmth from the room like a hungry mouth. 3 days after moving in, I couldn't ignore the compulsion any longer. I pressed my ear against the wall, holding my breath until my lungs burned. The silence was absolute, thick and suffocating. Then, driven by an impulse I couldn't name, I raised my fist and knocked 3 times against the drywall. The response was immediate and identical. 3 knocks, perfectly timed, coming from the other side. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. Sweat beaded on my forehead despite the room's chill. I stepped back from the wall, my legs suddenly unsteady. The logical part of my mind scrambled for explanations. Pipes, settling foundation, neighboring apartment activities. But the knocks had been too precise, too perfectly timed to be coincidental. I knocked again, this time in a complex pattern. 2 quick raps, pause. 3 slow ones, pause. 1 final sharp knock. The response came without delay, matching my rhythm exactly. My mouth went dry, tongue sticking to the roof of my mouth like sandpaper. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the building, every whisper of wind against the windows, sent adrenaline shooting through my system. I found myself staring at the wall, imagining I could see it breathing, expanding and contracting like lung tissue. When morning finally arrived, gray light filtering through the dirty windows, I was exhausted and trembling. The next evening, I brought home equipment from the office. A stud finder, acoustic detector, even a small thermal imaging camera I'd borrowed under the pretense of a home inspection project. My hands shook as I powered up the devices, professional curiosity warring with a growing sense of dread that felt like ice water in my veins. The stud finder revealed the expected wooden framework, but the acoustic detector picked up something that made my blood freeze. Behind the wall, faint but unmistakable, were sounds of movement, footsteps that seemed to mirror my own, but offset by what felt like several hours. When I moved from the kitchenette to the bathroom, I heard corresponding movement from beyond the wall, but the sound suggested someone had made that same journey much earlier. The thermal imaging revealed the most disturbing evidence yet. The camera showed a clear heat signature behind the wall, the outline of a living space identical to mine, complete with furniture placement that perfectly matched my own. But the heat patterns were old, as if the activity had occurred hours before I was detecting it. My rational mind tried to process this information, to find logical explanations, but my body was already responding to a more primitive understanding. My skin crawled with the sensation of being watched, studied, mimicked. The fine hairs on my arms stood on end, and a cold sweat broke out across my back. I spent the following days documenting everything. The sounds from behind the wall continued, always seeming to anticipate my movements. When I would wake at 3 a.m. to use the bathroom, I would hear the same journey being completed on the other side, but the footsteps sounded like they were finishing just as I was beginning. When I made coffee at 7 a.m., the sounds of morning routine would be wrapping up beyond the wall. Sleep became increasingly elusive. I would lie in bed, every muscle tense, listening to the phantom occupant of the mirror apartment going through what sounded like my exact bedtime routine, but hours ahead of schedule. The rustling of sheets, the creak of floorboards, even what sounded like the specific way I fluffed my pillow, all of it echoed from behind the wall with a timing that made my skin crawl. The truly terrifying realization came during my second week in the apartment. I had been methodically mapping the sounds, trying to understand the pattern, when I noticed something that made my vision blur with panic. The activities behind the wall weren't just similar to mine, they were identical, down to the most minute details. The number of steps from bed to bathroom, the duration of running water, even the pattern of my restless pacing when insomnia struck. But they were happening approximately 4 hours before I performed them. My hands trembled as I wrote this observation in my notebook, the pen leaving shaky marks across the page. My breathing became shallow and rapid. The implication was impossible, yet the evidence was undeniable. Something on the other side of that wall was living my life before I lived it. I began testing this theory with deliberate actions. I would decide to move a chair at exactly 8 p.m., and at 4 p.m., I would hear the scraping of furniture being moved in the same location beyond the wall. When I planned to cook dinner at 6:30, the sounds of meal preparation would begin on the other side at 2:30, following the exact sequence I would later perform. The sensation of being trapped in some cosmic echo chamber made my chest tight with claustrophobia. My appetite disappeared entirely. Food turned to ash in my mouth, and even water tasted metallic and wrong. Dark circles carved themselves under my eyes as sleep became an impossibility. Every time I closed my eyes, I could feel the presence on the other side of the wall, living my future, stealing my agency. The breaking point came when I heard my own voice. It was muffled by the wall, distorted but unmistakably mine. I was sitting at my small table, reviewing architectural plans, when I heard myself speaking beyond the wall. The cadence, the inflection, even the pauses for breath. It was perfectly me, but saying words I hadn't yet spoken. My pen fell from nerveless fingers, clattering to the floor. 4 hours later, I found myself speaking those exact words aloud, as if compelled by some invisible script. The realization that I was no longer in control of my own actions sent panic shooting through my nervous system like electricity. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my temples, behind my eyes, in my throat. I stopped eating regularly, stopped maintaining any routine. If I could become unpredictable, perhaps I could break whatever cycle had trapped me. But the sounds from behind the wall continued, now seeming to reflect my erratic behavior with the same 4-hour delay. My deliberate chaos was being pre-lived by my shadow self, making even rebellion feel scripted. The wall began to feel like a membrane rather than a barrier, something permeable and alive. When I pressed my palm against it, the surface felt warm, almost pulse-like. The paint seemed to shift and ripple under my touch, though when I looked directly at it, Everything appeared normal. My vision started playing tricks on me, peripheral movements that vanished when I turned my head, shadows that fell at impossible angles. Paranoia crept through my thoughts like poison. I became convinced that the building's other tenants were watching me, that the superintendent knew something he wasn't telling me, that the entire structure was somehow complicit in whatever was happening. When neighbors passed me in the hallway, their expressions seemed knowing, conspiratorial. Their casual greetings felt loaded with hidden meaning. My work suffered. Concentration became impossible when every moment was spent listening for the sounds from behind the wall, analyzing patterns, documenting the impossible. My boss expressed concern about my appearance and performance, but his words seemed to come from very far away, filtered through the constant white noise of terror that had taken up residence in my skull. The final revelation came when I realized I could influence the sounds. By planning specific actions with enough detail and intention, I could generate corresponding activity from behind the wall. It was like conducting a symphony of my own future, but the conductor was trapped in the audience, watching helplessly as the music played itself. Late one night, after weeks of mounting horror, I made a decision that felt both desperate and inevitable. I gathered every tool I could find, hammer, crowbar, utility knife, and approached the wall with shaking hands. If there was another apartment, another version of me living my life in advance, I needed to see it. I needed to understand what was wearing my face, speaking with my voice, stealing my future. As I raised the hammer, ready to tear through the drywall, the sounds from behind the wall stopped completely. The silence was more terrifying than any noise had been. In that absolute quiet, I could hear my own breathing, my own heartbeat, and nothing else. The building itself seemed to hold its breath. I struck the wall once, hard enough to crack the paint. The impact echoed strangely, as if the space beyond was vast and empty. But as the sound faded, I heard something that made me drop the hammer and stumble backward. From behind the wall came the sound of someone dropping a hammer and stumbling backward. But it happened at exactly the same time as my actions, not 4 hours earlier. The realization hit me like ice water in my veins. I had become the echo. I was now the one living 4 hours behind, following a script written by whatever version of me existed beyond that wall. The sounds I had been hearing weren't predicting my future. They were my past, performed by whoever I used to be before I moved into this apartment and became trapped in this temporal loop. Standing in that dimly lit room, surrounded by the evidence of my investigation, I understood that I might never escape this cycle. The wall wasn't a barrier between two apartments. It was a mirror reflecting different moments of the same existence, with me trapped somewhere in the middle, neither leading nor following, but suspended in an eternal echo of my own life. The hammer lay at my feet, and I knew that in 4 hours, I would pick it up again, make the same decision, discover the same truth, and realize once more that escape was an illusion. The wall watched me with its blank face, patient and eternal, keeping its terrible secret while I lived the same moments over and over, always 4 hours behind myself, always too late to change anything. In the growing darkness of the apartment, I could only wait for the cycle to begin again, knowing that somewhere beyond that wall, another version of me was just starting to notice that the blueprints didn't match the reality of the room. Story 9. The mountain swallowed sound. At 11,000 feet, even the wind seemed muffled, as if the thin air couldn't carry its own voice. The radio station perched on the peak like a metallic tumor, its transmission tower piercing the star-drunk sky with surgical precision. Inside, surrounded by walls that groaned against the altitude and cold, I sat alone with my instruments, monitoring frequencies that most people forgot existed. My name is Marcus Webb, and I've been working these remote stations for 18 years. At 41, I'd grown comfortable with isolation, with the particular silence that comes from being the only human being for 50 miles in any direction. But comfort and peace are different things entirely, and that October night, I learned the distinction with devastating clarity. The equipment hummed its familiar electronic lullaby as I ran through my routine checks. The transmitter gauges glowed amber in the dim control room, their needles steady as heartbeats. Everything normal, everything predictable. The night stretched ahead of me like a long corridor with no doors, just 12 hours of monitoring emergency frequencies and maintaining equipment that hadn't failed in months. Then I heard it. At first it was just static bleeding through on 1420 megahertz, a frequency that should have been empty. Dead air. But static has texture, and this wasn't random electromagnetic noise. There was pattern buried in the hiss, rhythm hiding beneath the surface. I adjusted the tuning, my fingers working the dials with practiced precision, and suddenly the static crystallized into something impossible. Music. Big band music from decades past. The kind my grandfather used to play on Sunday afternoons. The sound quality was pristine, too clean for such an old broadcast, as if someone had recorded it yesterday but chosen songs from another era entirely. The brass section swelled through my headphones, and my skin prickled with something that wasn't quite recognition. The song faded, and a voice emerged from the speakers. Smooth, professional, with that particular cadence radio announcers cultivated in the 1970s. The man spoke about weather conditions in Denver, traffic reports for highways that had been rerouted decades ago, and news about a presidential speech that I remembered studying in high school history class. Everything he mentioned had happened exactly 50 years ago, down to the day. My heart began beating faster, that irregular rhythm that comes when your brain encounters something it can't immediately categorize. I checked my equipment again, verified the frequency, ran diagnostics on the receiver. Everything functioned perfectly. The transmission was real, broadcasting with enough power to reach my equipment clearly despite originating from where exactly. The announcer continued his program with the casual confidence of someone completely unaware that his words were traveling through time. He discussed movie premieres I'd seen as documentaries, sporting events whose outcomes were already written in record books, political scandals that had been resolved and forgotten before I graduated college. But the most unsettling detail was how current everything sounded, as if these events were happening right now, tonight, in some parallel version of 1974. Commercial breaks punctuated the programming with advertisements for products that no longer existed, jingles for brands that had disappeared into corporate acquisitions decades ago. The sponsors spoke directly to listeners who were either long dead or had become grandparents in retirement homes. Yet the energy was immediate, urgent, alive with the particular electricity that only live radio possessed. I found myself leaning closer to the speakers, my rational mind searching for explanations, while something deeper recognized the impossibility of what I was experiencing. Radio waves don't travel through time. They can't. They propagate through space at the speed of light, weakening with distance, eventually fading into cosmic background radiation. There was no scientific principle that could account for what I was hearing, but the transmission continued, relentless in its normalcy. The announcer introduced the next segment, something about local news from a city I'd never visited. His voice carried that particular warmth that radio personalities cultivated, intimate and friendly, as if he were speaking directly to each listener individually. He talked about a fire at a downtown department store, a city council meeting about snow removal contracts, a high school football team's championship hopes. Then he said something that made my blood turn cold. He mentioned the radio technician working alone on the mountain station tonight, monitoring frequencies with equipment that wouldn't be invented for another 3 years. My hands froze over the control panel. The announcer couldn't have said what I thought I heard. I rewound the tape. I'd started recording automatically when the transmission began, and played back the last 30 seconds. The voice was clear, unmistakable, describing a man in his early 40s working the late shift at a remote transmission facility, checking equipment and watching amber gauges that glowed like tiny suns in the darkness. The description was too specific, too accurate. He mentioned details about the control room that no one could know unless they were physically present. The coffee stain on the equipment manual, the broken hinge on the equipment cabinet, the way the fluorescent light flickered intermittently over the transmitter array. Things I'd never reported, never mentioned to anyone. Details so mundane they'd never occurred to me as worth documenting. Sweat began collecting between my shoulder blades despite the mountain cold. The announcer continued his program as if he hadn't just shattered every assumption I held about reality. He played another song, something instrumental and melancholy, while I sat frozen in my chair, afraid to move in case any motion might confirm what he seemed already to know. The music ended, and his voice returned with that same casual professionalism. This time, he described how the technician, me, was sitting perfectly still, listening with growing horror as someone from 5 decades in the past detailed his present circumstances with impossible precision. He mentioned my elevated heart rate, the way my hands had started trembling, the cold sweat that was now running down my spine like ice water. I stood up abruptly, the chair rolling backward into the wall with a metallic crash. The sudden movement felt like breaking a spell, like shattering some invisible connection between that voice and my physical presence. But the announcer only chuckled, a sound that carried no malice but somehow felt more threatening than any overt hostility. He described my exact reaction, the way I'd stood up, where the chair had rolled, even the particular sound it made hitting the wall. His commentary continued in real time, a running narrative of my movements and responses that defied every natural law I understood. When I reached for the volume control, he anticipated the gesture. When I considered turning off the receiver entirely, he mentioned that impulse before I'd fully formed it myself. The rational part of my mind scrambled for explanations. Hidden cameras seemed absurd at this altitude and isolation. Some kind of elaborate prank would require resources and planning that made no sense. A psychological experiment would need institutional backing and ethical oversight that no legitimate organization would approve. Every logical possibility collapsed under the weight of what I was experiencing. But the transmission wasn't finished with me yet. The announcer began describing the station itself, not as it existed now, but as it had been when originally constructed. He talked about workers who had built the facility decades before I was born, engineers who had installed equipment that had been replaced multiple times since then. He knew the history of every component, every modification, every repair that had been made over the decades. More disturbing still, he spoke about plans for future upgrades, modifications that wouldn't happen for years, describing technology that didn't yet exist with the casual familiarity of someone who had personally overseen its installation. My breathing became shallow, rapid, each inhalation feeling insufficient despite the thin mountain air. The control room felt smaller now, as if the walls were contracting, pressing inward with the weight of impossible knowledge. The familiar amber light seemed dimmer, casting shadows that moved independently of their sources. Every surface reflected versions of myself that looked increasingly foreign, increasingly frightened. The announcer mentioned a photograph tucked inside my equipment manual, a picture of my ex-wife and daughter that I'd forgotten was there until that moment. He described the precise page where I'd placed it, between the sections on frequency modulation and antenna maintenance, and speculated about why I kept it hidden rather than displayed. His observations were uncomfortably accurate, touching on feelings I'd never articulated even to myself. Then he began talking about tomorrow. He described events that hadn't happened yet with the same confident certainty he'd used for historical facts. He mentioned a phone call I would receive at 9:15 in the morning, a conversation with my supervisor about equipment malfunctions that hadn't occurred yet. He detailed a decision I would make about requesting a transfer, a choice I hadn't consciously considered but recognized immediately as something I would indeed contemplate. The future he described felt inevitable, as if my choices had already been made, my path already determined by forces operating outside normal time. Free will became a comforting illusion, something I'd believed in because the alternative was too terrifying to acknowledge. If this voice from 1974 could see my present and predict my future, then what did that make me? A character in someone else's story? A puppet dancing to music I couldn't hear? My vision began tunneling, edges darkening as panic constricted my perception to an increasingly narrow focus. The control room equipment blurred into abstract shapes, amber lights becoming distant stars in a sky that was collapsing inward. My legs felt unsteady, as if the floor beneath me had become unstable, as if gravity itself had become negotiable. The announcer's voice grew gentler now, almost sympathetic, as if he recognized the psychological strain his revelations were causing. He spoke about the nature of time itself, how moments that seemed sequential were actually simultaneous, how past and future existed in the same eternal present that only looked linear from inside the experience. His words carried the authority of someone who had transcended normal temporal boundaries, who had learned to see existence from a perspective that made conventional reality seem quaint and limited. He explained that radio waves, under certain atmospheric conditions and electromagnetic alignments that occurred perhaps once every 50 years, could transcend their normal physical limitations. They could become unstuck from linear time, carrying information backward and forward through decades as easily as across miles. Tonight, he said, was one of those rare convergences when the boundaries between then and now became permeable. But the most disturbing revelation came last. The announcer explained that he wasn't speaking from 1974 at all. He was speaking from right now, from this exact moment, using equipment that existed in a version of the present that ran parallel to my own. In his reality, it was still 1974, would always be 1974, just as in mine it was still this October night in 2024. Time wasn't linear, but layered, with different versions of the present existing simultaneously, occasionally intersecting through electromagnetic anomalies that allowed communication between parallel timelines. This meant that somewhere, in a version of now that looked like 50 years ago, another radio technician was working alone on a mountain station, receiving transmissions from a future he would recognize as impossible. And that technician was me, or a version of me, broadcasting forward through time just as this announcer was broadcasting backward, creating an endless loop of temporal communication that transcended normal causality. The realization hit me with physical force, as if the air pressure in the control room had suddenly doubled. My chair, my equipment, my coffee-stained manual, everything familiar became foreign, artifacts from a reality I could no longer trust. The amber lights weren't just indicators anymore. They were beacons communicating across temporal barriers, signaling to versions of myself scattered throughout parallel timelines. The transmission began fading then, static gradually reclaiming the frequency as whatever cosmic alignment had made the communication possible slowly dissolved. The announcer's voice grew distant, echoing as if speaking from the bottom of a very deep well. His final words were both reassuring and terrifying. This convergence would happen again, exactly 50 years from now, when another version of me would receive these same transmissions and experience this same impossible night. The static consumed the last traces of his voice, leaving only the familiar hum of my equipment and the sound of my own rapid breathing in the thin mountain air. I sat in the control room for the remaining hours of my shift, afraid to move, afraid to think too deeply about what I'd experienced. The amber lights continued their steady glow, but now they seemed to pulse with hidden meaning, as if they were counting down to the next convergence, the next breach in the barriers between parallel presents. When morning finally came, I filed my report as usual, mentioning nothing about the impossible transmission. Some experiences exist beyond the reach of official documentation, beyond the categories that normal reality uses to make sense of itself. I requested a transfer to a ground-level station the next week, telling my supervisor I needed a change of environment. But late at night, when the world grows quiet and radio waves travel farther through the darkness, I sometimes tune my personal receiver to that same frequency. I listen to the static, waiting for another voice to break through from a parallel now, another version of myself broadcasting across the impossible distances between realities that exist simultaneously in the same eternal moment. The mountain keeps its secrets well, but I know now that time is not the linear progression we pretend it is. Somewhere, in a version of this moment that looks like 1974, another radio technician is learning the same terrifying truth. And 50 years from now, when the cosmic conditions align again, someone else will sit alone on that mountain, listening to transmissions from a past that is also the present, discovering that reality is far stranger and more interconnected than anyone dares imagine. The signal is always there, waiting in the static between stations, carrying voices across time like messages in bottles thrown into an ocean of electromagnetic waves. All you have to do is listen carefully enough, and trust that the impossible is simply another word for what we don't yet understand. Story 10. The tunnels beneath the city hold secrets that were never meant to surface. In 46 years of breathing stale underground air and feeling vibrations through concrete bones, I thought I knew every inch of this labyrinth. I was wrong. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness ahead, illuminating the familiar curve of Track 7's maintenance tunnel. The fluorescent work lights had failed again, third time this month, leaving me to navigate by the pale yellow circle that danced ahead of my footsteps. My breath formed small clouds in the underground chill, and somewhere in the distance, water dripped with metronomic persistence. I'd been walking for 20 minutes when I first noticed something off. The tunnel should have curved left by now, following the path I'd taken hundreds of times before. Instead, it continued straight, deeper into what felt like the Earth's belly. My pulse quickened, but I pushed forward. Tunnel networks could be deceptive, especially at night when shadows played tricks with perception. That's when I saw the light. Not the harsh glare of work lamps or the sterile glow of emergency lighting, but something warmer, softer. It spilled from an opening I'd never seen before, about 50 yards ahead. My throat went dry. In 15 years working these specific tunnels, I'd memorized every alcove, every utility access, every goddamn rivet in the walls. The opening led to stairs, wide tiled stairs that descended into what could only be described as a station platform, but that was impossible. This section of the network had been mapped and remapped. There were no stations here. My hands trembled as I reached for my radio to contact dispatch, but static filled my earpiece. White noise that seemed to pulse with its own rhythm, almost like breathing. I adjusted the frequency, tried again. Nothing but that soft, persistent static that made my skin crawl. The platform spread before me like something preserved in amber. Pristine white tiles reflected my flashlight beam, and vintage advertisements lined the walls, products I recognized from my childhood, with prices that seemed laughably low. A Coca-Cola sign promised refreshment for a nickel. A cigarette ad featured a doctor recommending a particular brand for throat health. My footsteps echoed differently here, muffled somehow, as if the air itself was thicker. The familiar subway smell of metal and oil was replaced by something else, old paper, dust, and underneath it all, something sweet and cloying that made my stomach turn. At the platform's edge sat a train. Not one of our modern cars with their sleek designs and electronic displays, but something from decades past. The metal was polished to a mirror shine, its windows dark and reflecting my pale face back at me. No graffiti marred its surface, no wear marks from countless passengers. It looked like it had just rolled off the assembly line in 1962. My heart hammered against my ribs as I approached. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around, to run back through that impossible tunnel. But my feet carried me forward. The train car doors stood open, revealing red vinyl seats arranged in neat rows. The interior lighting was warm and inviting, a stark contrast to the harsh fluorescence I was used to. I stepped inside. The moment my boot crossed the threshold, something changed. The air became charged, electric, making the hair on my arms stand on end. Behind me, I heard a soft pneumatic hiss, and my blood turned to ice as I spun around to see the doors sliding shut with deliberate slowness. I lunged for the closing gap, but my fingers scraped uselessly against smooth metal. The doors sealed with a final, decisive click that seemed to echo through my bones. Panic flooded my system, hot and acidic. I pressed my palms against the glass, searching for any kind of release mechanism, but found only seamless surfaces. That's when the train began to move. Not with the familiar jolt and grinding of subway cars, but with fluid grace that seemed to defy physics. No warning bells, no conductor's announcement, just smooth acceleration that pressed me gently back against one of the vinyl seats. Through the windows, the station platform slid past, then disappeared into darkness. My breathing came in short, sharp gasps that fogged the glass. I tried the radio again, desperate for any connection to the world above, but received only that rhythmic static that now seemed almost like whispered words I couldn't quite make out. The tunnel walls outside moved past at increasing speed, but they looked wrong. Too smooth, too uniform, as if carved by some massive boring machine that had worked with impossible precision. The familiar cable runs and utility pipes were absent, replaced by surfaces that seemed to absorb rather than reflect my flashlight beam. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. Time felt distorted in that pristine car, stretching and contracting like taffy. The train's movement was hypnotic, lulling me into a state between waking and sleep where reality became negotiable. I found myself staring at the advertisements inside the car, reading and rereading claims about miracle cures and revolutionary products that had never existed. The temperature was dropping. I could see my breath now, and the vinyl seats had become cold to the touch. My joints ached with the chill, and I rubbed my hands together, trying to maintain circulation. The heating system, if there was one, remained silent. It was then that I noticed the other passengers. They sat in the shadows at the far end of the car, motionless figures that I somehow hadn't seen when I first entered. My throat constricted as I squinted through the gloom, trying to make out details. 3 of them, seated separately, all facing forward with perfect posture. I called out, my voice cracking with the effort, asked if they knew where the train was going, if they'd been riding long, but none of them responded or even acknowledged my presence. They sat like mannequins, unnaturally still. My skin crawled as I noticed their clothing, styles from decades past, immaculately maintained but somehow wrong. The fabrics looked too new for their vintage cuts, and the colors seemed to shift subtly in the train's amber lighting. One figure wore a fedora that cast deep shadows across his face, while another was dressed in a woman's coat with a fur collar that seemed to move slightly, as if breathing. The train began to slow. Another platform emerged from the darkness ahead, identical to the first in every detail except for one horrifying difference. This one was occupied. Dozens of figures stood in perfect formation along the platform's edge, all facing the approaching train. They wore the same vintage clothing as my fellow passengers, their faces hidden in shadow despite the platform's warm lighting. As we pulled into the station, none of them moved. They simply stood there, waiting, their stillness so complete it seemed to radiate from them like cold. The train came to a stop with barely a whisper, and I held my breath, praying the doors would remain closed. They opened with that same soft hiss. None of the platform figures moved to board, and my 3 fellow passengers remained seated. For long minutes, nothing happened. The only sound was my own ragged breathing and the distant drip of water that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Then, slowly, one of the platform figures turned its head toward me. I couldn't see its face clearly, but I felt its attention like a physical weight. Others began to turn as well, dozens of heads swiveling in my direction with mechanical precision. My hands shook so violently I could barely hold my flashlight steady. Without warning, the doors closed, and the train resumed its impossible journey. The platforms multiplied. Station after station slid past, each one filled with more of those waiting figures. Sometimes they stood in neat rows, sometimes scattered across the platform in patterns that hurt to look at directly. Always, they turned to watch as I passed, their attention following the train until we disappeared back into the tunnels. My sanity began to fray at the edges. The rational part of my mind insisted this was impossible. Subway systems didn't extend infinitely. Trains didn't run on abandoned tracks, and those couldn't be real people standing on those platforms. But the cold vinyl seat beneath me, the fog of my breath, the gentle swaying of the car, everything felt undeniably real. I began to notice changes in my fellow passengers. The figure in the fedora had shifted slightly, his head now angled in my direction, though his face remained hidden. The woman's fur collar definitely moved now, rising and falling with what could only be breathing. The third figure, dressed in what looked like a bus driver's uniform from the 1960s, had begun to drum his fingers silently on his knee. Time stretched impossibly. My watch had stopped at 11:47, the hands frozen in place despite the second hand's attempt to move. Battery dead, maybe, but the synchronicity felt deliberate. Everything in this place seemed designed to disorient, to strip away familiar reference points until I questioned my own perceptions. The train began to slow again, but this time something was different. The tunnel ahead glowed with harsh white light, growing brighter as we approached. I pressed my face against the window, trying to see what awaited us, and my blood froze. It was my original platform, the same tiled walls, the same vintage advertisements, the same impossible perfection. But now I understood what I'd missed before. There, at the platform's edge, stood a figure in maintenance coveralls, flashlight in hand, staring at the approaching train with wide, terrified eyes. It was me. The train stopped, and the doors opened. My doppelganger stepped inside, moving with jerky, unnatural motions like a poorly operated puppet. He took a seat near the front, his face a mask of confusion and growing fear. The doors closed, and the train began to move again. I tried to call out to him, to warn him, but no sound emerged from my throat. My voice had abandoned me, leaving only the ability to observe as my duplicate experienced the same journey I'd just completed. The same discovery, the same terror, the same growing realization that escape might not be possible. But I wasn't the same person who'd first entered this train. Something had changed during the journey, some fundamental shift in my being that I couldn't quite identify. The fear was still there, but it felt distant now, like a memory rather than an immediate emotion. The cold didn't bite as sharply, and the bizarre sights outside the windows seemed almost familiar. As we pulled into the next station, my station, repeated endlessly, I saw another figure waiting on the platform. Same coveralls, same flashlight, same expression of dawning horror. He stepped aboard, and now there were two of me riding this impossible train through tunnels that couldn't exist. Then three, then four. Each iteration brought a new understanding. This wasn't just a train or a journey, it was a collection, a gathering of possibilities, of moments where choices had been made and paths taken. Every version of me that had found this place, every decision that had led to stepping through those doors. The original passenger figures began to make sense now. The fedora man, the woman with the fur collar, the bus driver, they were the first, the pioneers who had discovered this place before subway systems even existed. They'd been riding longer than I could comprehend, watching as new additions joined their ranks. I felt my own stillness beginning to set in. The frantic need to escape was fading, replaced by a kind of resigned acceptance. This was where I belonged now, in this space between spaces, traveling tracks that existed in the margins of reality. The train continued its eternal circuit, collecting more versions of myself and others who had stumbled into this pocket of impossibility. Outside the windows, the platforms multiplied, and the waiting figures grew in number. All of us trapped in an endless journey through tunnels that shouldn't exist. Somewhere in the distance, I knew, morning would come to the surface world. My absence would be noted, search parties organized, reports filed. But they would never find this place, because it existed in the spaces between their maps, in the gaps where reality grew thin. I settled back into my seat, feeling the vinyl grow warm beneath me as acceptance took hold. The train swayed gently as it curved through impossible turns, carrying its collection of lost souls through the darkness beneath a city that had forgotten we ever existed. The rhythm of the wheels on the tracks began to sound almost like music, and for the first time since stepping aboard, I felt something resembling peace. This was my route now, my territory to patrol, my responsibility to maintain. After all, someone had to keep the trains running on time. Story 11. The first time I noticed it, my coffee cup was still warm in my hands, steam curling up like ghostly fingers in the morning light filtering through the museum's tall windows. The Mesopotamian fertility idol, a crude clay figure with exaggerated feminine features, sat 3 inches to the left of where I had positioned it the night before. 3 inches. Not enough for most people to notice, but after 28 years of curating ancient artifacts, I could spot a displaced piece from across the room. My name is David Kellerman, and at 58, I thought I had seen everything the past could throw at me. I was wrong. The displacement bothered me more than it should have. Security had reported nothing unusual during their rounds, and the motion sensors showed no triggered alerts. I repositioned the idol, making sure its base aligned perfectly with the faint outline left by decades of dust accumulation on the display case's felt surface. The precision calmed me, restored order to what felt like a small violation of my carefully maintained domain. But the next morning, it had moved again. This time, the idol sat facing a different direction entirely, no longer looking out toward the museum visitors, but turned inward, toward the other pieces in the pre-Columbian collection. Its crude face seemed to stare directly at the obsidian ceremonial knife displayed on the adjacent pedestal. My hands trembled slightly as I reached for my measuring tape, confirming what my eyes already knew. The piece had rotated exactly 45 degrees clockwise. I checked the security logs again, scrolling through hours of digital footage on my computer screen until my eyes burned and my neck ached from hunching forward. Nothing. The camera positioned directly above the display showed the idol in one position at 11:47 p.m., then in the new position at 12:03 a.m. Between those timestamps, 16 minutes of absolutely nothing happening. No movement, no shadows, no disturbance of any kind. The rational part of my brain, the part that had earned me a PhD in archaeology and built my reputation as a meticulous scholar, insisted on simple explanations. Building settlement, vibrations from the nearby subway line, cleaning staff accidentally bumping displays despite strict protocols. But as I watched the same impossible repositioning occur night after night, involving different artifacts across multiple collections, rational explanations began to crumble like ancient papyrus exposed to light. The Egyptian canopic jar moved 4 inches closer to its companion pieces. The Celtic bronze torque twisted itself into a different configuration. The Aztec obsidian mirror, which I had positioned facing the gallery entrance, somehow turned to reflect the opposite wall. Each movement was subtle, purposeful, and completely invisible to our sophisticated surveillance system. Sleep became elusive. I would lie in bed, my mind racing through possibilities, my heart hammering against my ribs as I imagined the artifacts moving through the dark corridors like sleepwalkers. My sheets grew damp with sweat as I pictured their careful, deliberate repositioning, as if they were following some ancient choreography I couldn't comprehend. During the day, I found myself studying the pieces with new intensity, searching their surfaces for clues I might have missed. The fertility idol's clay surface felt different under my gloved fingers, somehow warmer than room temperature, despite the climate-controlled environment. The obsidian knife seemed to pulse with its own dark energy, and I caught myself avoiding direct eye contact with its polished surface, as if it might somehow look back. My assistant, Margaret, noticed my deteriorating condition and suggested I take some time off. She mentioned that I had been muttering to myself while examining displays, that I had been arriving earlier and staying later each day. Her concern felt genuine, but I couldn't explain what was happening without sounding like I was losing my mind. Perhaps I was. The decision to spend the night in the museum came during my 4th sleepless evening at home. If the cameras couldn't capture what was happening, maybe human observation could. I told security I would be working late on inventory, a plausible excuse that bought me solitude with my moving collection. I positioned myself in the pre-Columbian wing with a thermos of coffee and a notebook, determined to maintain scientific objectivity despite the hammering of my pulse. The museum, after hours, possessed an entirely different character than during public visiting times. Without the buffer of human voices and footsteps, every small sound became amplified and ominous. The building's old bones creaked and settled around me, creating a symphony of whispers and sighs that seemed to emanate from the artifacts themselves. At first, nothing happened. I sat motionless in my chair, watching the display cases with the intensity of a predator studying prey. My eyes began to water from the strain of staring without blinking. My lower back ached from maintaining rigid posture. The coffee grew cold in my hands, then bitter, then undrinkable. Then, just past midnight, I saw it. The movement was so subtle, so impossibly slow, that my brain initially dismissed it as optical illusion. The fertility idol appeared to be breathing, its rounded form expanding and contracting almost imperceptibly. I blinked hard, rubbed my eyes, convinced I was hallucinating from exhaustion and stress. But when I looked again, the breathing motion continued. My throat constricted as I realized what I was witnessing. The artifact wasn't moving at normal speed and then stopping between camera frames. It was moving continuously, but at a pace so gradual that only prolonged observation could detect it. Like watching the hour hand of a clock, or the growth of a plant. Movement that occurred in a time frame beyond normal human perception. I pulled out my phone and began recording, though I doubted the camera would capture what my eyes were seeing. The idol's slow breathing motion gradually became more pronounced, and I realized it wasn't breathing at all. It was turning, rotating with such glacial precision that each degree of movement took several minutes to complete. As I watched, transfixed with a mixture of terror and fascination, other pieces began their own imperceptible dance. The obsidian knife started sliding across its display surface with the speed of spreading honey. The canopic jar began a slow rotation toward its companions. The bronze torque unwound itself with mechanical precision, its metal coils separating and repositioning with purposeful intent. My notebook fell from nerveless fingers, hitting the floor with a sound that seemed to echo through the entire building. The artifacts continued their deliberate movements, oblivious to my presence or my growing panic. I tried to stand but found my legs unsteady, my vision swimming as adrenaline flooded my system. What I witnessed next challenged every assumption I had about the nature of reality itself. The artifacts weren't just moving randomly, they were arranging themselves into specific patterns. The fertility idol rotated to face the obsidian knife at a precise angle. The canopic jar positioned itself to complete some sort of triangular formation with the other Egyptian pieces. The bronze torque reformed into a perfect circle, its ends meeting with mathematical precision. But it was the pattern emerging across multiple display cases that truly terrified me. As pieces from different cultures and time periods moved into alignment, I began to recognize something that made my blood run cold. The positioning wasn't random, it was ritualistic. The artifacts were recreating some sort of ancient ceremony, using their slow, imperceptible movements to form sacred geometries that had been old when the pyramids were young. My breathing became rapid and shallow as I realized the implications. These weren't just museum pieces, they were active participants in something beyond my understanding. Something that had been continuing for who knows how long, invisible to human observation because we simply moved too fast to perceive their ancient rhythms. The temperature in the room seemed to drop as the ritual formation neared completion. My breath began to mist in the suddenly frigid air, and I could feel something building, an energy that made the hair on my arms stand on end and set my teeth on edge. The artifacts pulsed with their own subtle light, visible only in my peripheral vision, vanishing whenever I tried to look directly at them. I wanted to run, but found myself paralyzed by the magnitude of what I was witnessing. These pieces had been collected from civilizations separated by thousands of years and thousands of miles. Yet they were working together with perfect coordination. They remembered something that predated human recorded history, some universal truth that connected all ancient cultures through their spiritual practices. The obsidian knife completed its journey across the display case and came to rest, pointing directly at me. In that moment, I felt observed, not by the artifacts themselves, but by something far older and more vast that was using them as conduits. The sensation of being studied by an intelligence that operated on geological timescales made my skin crawl and my vision blur with tears of pure terror. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the movement stopped. The artifacts settled into their new positions with an almost audible sigh of completion. The temperature began to return to normal, and the oppressive sense of being watched gradually faded. But the new arrangement remained, a testament to what I had witnessed, or what had witnessed me. I spent the remainder of the night motionless in my chair, afraid to move or make any sound that might restart the ritual. My mind raced with the implications of what I had seen, but my body remained frozen by a terror that went deeper than rational fear. This was the primitive fear of standing at the edge of an abyss and realizing that the abyss was looking back. When morning finally came and the first security guard arrived for his shift, I managed to stand on unsteady legs and make my way to the exit. I told him I had worked through the night and needed to go home to rest. The lie came easily, but the truth would have sounded like the ravings of a madman. In the weeks that followed, I tried to return to normal routines, but everything had changed. The artifacts no longer seemed like static objects from the past. They were active participants in something ongoing and immense. I found myself avoiding certain wings of the museum, unable to meet the carved eyes of statues or handle ceremonial objects without trembling. I began researching connections between ancient cultures, looking for evidence of shared rituals or beliefs that might explain what I had witnessed. What I found only deepened my unease. Across continents and millennia, cultures had consistently described entities that existed in extended time, beings that moved so slowly that human lifespans passed like heartbeats to them. They were described as watchers, guardians, judges who operated on cosmic scales. The artifacts continue their subtle movements, I'm sure of it. But now I understand that what I witnessed was just a glimpse of something much larger, a ceremony that has been ongoing since before human civilization began, and will continue long after we're gone. The museum isn't just a repository for ancient objects. It's an active temple where the old gods still perform their patient rituals, one imperceptible movement at a time. I still come to work each day, but I no longer arrange the displays with the same confident precision. Instead, I've learned to respect the arrangements the artifacts choose for themselves. Because now I know the truth that museum curators are not supposed to discover. We don't preserve the past. We are merely witnesses to its continued existence. And sometimes, late at night when the building settles around its ancient occupants, I can feel them watching me with their patient, terrible eyes, deciding whether I'm worthy of witnessing their next slow dance through eternity. Story 12. Something was wrong with the light in that house from the moment I stepped through the front door. Not wrong in any way I could name, not flickering bulbs or faulty wiring, but wrong like a whisper in an empty room, wrong like finding your own footprints in fresh snow where you've never walked. The mansion squatted on Elm Street like a tumor of Victorian excess, all Gothic peaks and ornate cornices that seemed to claw at the gray October sky. Mrs. Hartwell had called that morning, her voice thin and brittle over the phone, explaining that several rooms had lost power and that strange electrical issues plagued the entire structure. Standard work for a guy like me. 34 years of wrestling copper wire and junction boxes had prepared me for most anything, or so I thought. The heavy oak door groaned open before I could knock, revealing a woman in her 70s with silver hair pulled back in a severe bun. Mrs. Hartwell's pale blue eyes darted nervously as she explained that the problems had started 3 weeks ago, first in the library, then spreading to the drawing room and master bedroom. She mentioned that several other electricians had come to look but left abruptly, claiming they couldn't find the source of the issue. The way she said it made my stomach flutter with unease, but I needed the work. She led me through a maze of corridors lined with oil paintings whose subjects seemed to track my movement with their painted eyes. The hardwood floors creaked beneath our feet, each sound echoing strangely in the cavernous spaces. That's when I first noticed it, the shadows. At first, it was just a nagging sensation, like trying to remember a word that sits just beyond reach. The afternoon sun streamed through tall windows, casting long rectangles of light across the Persian rugs and antique furniture. But the shadows they created felt wrong somehow. A grandfather clock stood near the east wall, backlit by a window, yet its shadow stretched toward the source of light rather than away from it. A marble bust on a pedestal cast its dark outline in 3 different directions simultaneously, as if multiple light sources illuminated it, though only one window provided illumination. My hands began to sweat as I set down my toolbox in the library. The room stretched impossibly high, filled with leather-bound volumes that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Mrs. Hartwell explained that this room had been the first to lose power, pointing to the ornate chandelier hanging dark and lifeless above us. I assured her I'd have it working shortly, though my voice sounded hollow in that vast space. She left me alone with a promise to bring tea later. The silence that followed felt oppressive, thick like humidity before a storm. I pulled out my voltage tester and began checking the wall outlets. Each one was dead, no electricity flowing through the circuits. Strange, considering the hallway lights had been working perfectly. As I worked, removing outlet covers and tracing wires, the wrongness of the shadows became impossible to ignore. My own shadow, cast by the tall window behind me, fell at an angle that defied physics. When I moved left, it sometimes moved right. When I knelt down, it remained standing. My heart began hammering against my ribs like a caged bird. I tried to focus on the wiring, following the electrical path through walls and conduits, but my eyes kept drifting to the darkness, pooling in corners where it shouldn't exist. A reading chair near the fireplace cast a shadow that seemed to extend far deeper than the physical space allowed, as if the floor had opened into an abyss beneath it. The temperature in the library began to drop perceptibly. My breath started misting in the suddenly frigid air, and goosebumps erupted along my arms. I checked my watch. Only an hour had passed, yet it felt like I'd been trapped in this room for days. The afternoon light outside had dimmed to an unnatural twilight gray. That's when I heard it. A sound like fabric rustling, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. I spun around, my pulse racing, but saw nothing except those impossible shadows, stretching and writhing in ways that shadows simply cannot move. One particularly dark patch near the bookcases seemed to pulse with its own rhythm, expanding and contracting like breathing. My throat felt parched, my mouth cotton dry. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, to grab my tools and run from this house as fast as my legs could carry me. But pride and desperation kept me rooted in place. I needed this job, needed the money it would bring. I forced myself to concentrate on the electrical panel I'd located behind a hidden door. The breakers all appeared normal, properly set and functioning. Yet when I tested the circuits, nothing responded. It was as if electricity simply refused to flow through this house, as if the very walls rejected the life-giving current. As I worked deeper into the evening, the shadows grew bolder. What had been merely unsettling distortions earlier now moved with deliberate purpose. I watched a shadow detach itself from a bookshelf and glide across the floor like oil on water. Another seemed to reach toward me with finger-like projections before I blinked, and it returned to its natural shape. The rustling sound grew louder, more insistent. It reminded me of wings, thousands of wings beating in unison, though no source was visible. My hands shook as I tried to focus on my multimeter readings, but the numbers kept swimming before my eyes. Mrs. Hartwell returned with tea as promised, though her entrance startled me so badly I nearly dropped my tools. She set down the tray with shaking hands, her face pale and drawn. She mentioned that the other electricians had reported similar experiences. Shadows that behaved strangely, sounds that couldn't be explained, a sensation of being watched by invisible eyes. Her voice trembled as she admitted that she'd been considering selling the house, but no buyers had stayed long enough to make serious offers. After she left, I made a discovery that chilled me to the bone. In testing a wall outlet, I noticed that the shadow it cast extended not just along the wall's surface, but seemed to continue into the wall itself, creating depth where none should exist. Tentatively, I reached toward this impossible shadow with my screwdriver. The metal passed through what should have been solid wall as if it were empty air. The shadow had depth, actual, physical depth that defied every law of physics I understood. My tool disappeared into the darkness up to the handle, meeting no resistance. When I pulled it back out, the metal felt ice cold and was covered in a thin layer of frost. My breathing became rapid and shallow. The rational part of my mind insisted this was impossible, that stress and poor lighting were playing tricks on my perception. But the evidence stood before me, undeniable and terrifying. These weren't shadows at all. They were openings, holes in reality itself. Compelled by a mixture of scientific curiosity and growing dread, I approached the largest shadow in the room, a massive dark patch behind the main bookcase that seemed to extend infinitely in all directions. As I drew closer, the rustling sound intensified, joined by what sounded like whispers in languages I didn't recognize. I knelt beside this shadow portal and peered into its depths. At first, I saw only absolute darkness, blacker than the deepest night. But as my eyes adjusted, shapes began to emerge from the void. And then I saw them. Eyes. Hundreds of eyes. Maybe thousands. All focused intently on me. They weren't human eyes. Too large, too bright, with pupils that shifted and writhed like living things. Some blinked in slow, hypnotic rhythms, while others stared with unblinking intensity. I could feel their gaze pressing against my mind, probing, examining, cataloging everything about me. My scream caught in my throat as one particularly large eye moved closer to the surface of the shadow portal. Behind it, I could make out the suggestion of a massive form, something vast and ancient and utterly alien. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, and I realized with growing horror that they were speaking to me, trying to communicate across whatever impossible barrier separated our realities. Terror flooded my system like poison. My heart hammered so hard I thought it might burst. Sweat poured down my face despite the frigid temperature. My legs gave out and I collapsed backward, scrambling away from that terrible aperture on hands and knees. The eyes followed my movement, tracking me with predatory patience. I understood then that these beings, whatever they were, had been watching the house's inhabitants for far longer than the 3 weeks Mrs. Hartwell had mentioned. They'd been studying us, learning about us, preparing for something. I grabbed my tools with shaking hands and fled the library, not caring about the job or the money or my professional reputation. Behind me, the rustling sound grew to a roar, and I swear I could hear something large pressing against the boundaries of that shadow world, testing the barriers that kept it from spilling into our reality. Mrs. Hartwell called after me as I burst through the front door, but I didn't stop running until I reached my truck. Even then, as I fumbled with the keys, I could see those impossible shadows moving inside the mansion's windows, reaching, stretching, growing larger. I drove away from Elm Street that night and never returned. The next morning, I found Mrs. Hartwell's check in my mailbox with a note attached. She thanked me for my honesty and mentioned that she'd decided to move in with her sister in California. The house would remain empty, she wrote, until someone figured out how to seal the openings permanently. But I know the truth. Those shadows aren't contained to one old mansion. I see them everywhere now, in alleyways and under bridges, in the corners of rooms where light should but doesn't reach. The barriers between worlds aren't as solid as we pretend they are. And somewhere, in dimensions we can't comprehend, ancient eyes continue to watch and wait, studying our reality through portals we mistake for simple shadows. Every electrician job I take now fills me with dread, because electricity follows the path of least resistance, and I've learned that resistance between worlds is far less than we ever imagined. The darkness is patient, and it's always watching, waiting for the right moment to step through those shadow doors and claim what it's been observing for so long. The light we depend on is nothing more than a thin barrier against something vast and hungry that dwells in the spaces between spaces. And sometimes, late at night when I'm alone with my work, I can feel those eyes on me still, cataloging, learning, preparing for the day when the shadows grow deep enough to bridge the gap between what is and what waits in the dark. Story 13. The blueprints shouldn't have existed. That was my first thought when I pulled the yellowed papers from the filing cabinet in the theater's basement office, my flashlight beam cutting through decades of dust and neglect. The signature in the bottom right corner made my stomach drop. Edmund Blackwood, architect, 1923. The construction records clearly stated the Orpheum Theater was built in 1953, 30 years after Blackwood had died in the influenza pandemic. My name is Marcus Reed, and I've been a civil engineer for 18 years. I've renovated everything from century-old factories to condemned hospitals, but nothing had prepared me for what I'd find in that crumbling theater on Elm Street. The city had hired me to assess the structural integrity and oversee renovations for its planned reopening. It was supposed to be a straightforward job. 6 months, decent pay, and the chance to restore something beautiful to its former glory. The first week passed normally enough. I'd arrive each morning to the musty smell of decay and the creak of settling timber. The building groaned under its own weight, pipes rattled in the walls, and the old heating system produced sounds like dying animals. Standard stuff for a building that had been empty for 2 decades. My crew of 6 men worked efficiently, stripping away layers of peeling paint and rotted wood, revealing the theater's bones beneath. But those blueprints bothered me. I'd studied them for hours, comparing them to the actual structure, and they matched perfectly. Every beam, every support column, every seemingly random architectural choice was detailed in Blackwood's precise handwriting. The man had drawn plans for a building that wouldn't exist for 3 decades after his death. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe the city records were wrong. Maybe Blackwood had designed it earlier and construction was delayed. But the more I researched, the more impossible it became. Blackwood's obituary was right there in the 1923 newspaper archives. Renowned architect Edmund Blackwood succumbed to influenza at age 47. His innovative designs challenged conventional notions of space and dimension. That phrase stuck with me. Challenged conventional notions of space and dimension. The first anomaly appeared during the 2nd week. Tommy, my foreman, came to me with a confused expression, hard hat in his hands, wiping sweat from his forehead despite the October chill that permeated the building. He told me about finding a door on the 2nd floor that led to a corridor not shown on any of our current plans. When he'd opened it, expecting a closet or storage space, he'd found himself looking down a hallway that seemed to stretch impossibly far, lined with doors that shouldn't fit within the theater's external walls. The geometry was wrong, he said. All wrong. I followed him upstairs, my boots echoing on the wooden steps that groaned under our weight. The door was exactly where he'd said it would be, painted the same faded green as the rest of the corridor. I turned the brass handle and stepped inside. The hallway stretched before me, lit by a source I couldn't identify. No windows, no fixtures, yet somehow not completely dark. The ceiling seemed higher than it should be, and the walls curved in ways that made my eyes water. I counted my steps as I walked, 10, 20, 30 feet, but when I looked back, the door I'd entered through appeared to be only a few feet away. My heart hammered against my ribs. I'd studied engineering for years, understood load distribution and spatial relationships, but this defied everything I knew. I pulled out my measuring tape, hands trembling slightly, and confirmed what my eyes were telling me. The hallway was simultaneously 30 feet long and 10 feet long, depending on which direction I measured from. I backed out quickly, slamming the door behind me. Tommy was waiting, his face pale. Neither of us spoke about it to the other men. The incidents escalated. Workers began reporting sounds from the empty auditorium. Not the settling creaks and groans we'd grown accustomed to, but rhythmic clapping. Applause. It would start softly, like a scattered few people clapping, then build to a thunderous ovation before cutting off abruptly. When we investigated, the auditorium was always empty. Rows of red velvet seats covered in dust, the stage dark and vacant. I started staying later, working alone in the office, poring over Blackwood's plans. The more I studied them, the more disturbed I became. Hidden in the margins were notes in his spidery handwriting. The boundaries between here and there are thinner in spaces of performance. The audience never truly leaves. They return to the places where they felt most alive. My sleep became fitful. I'd wake at 3 a.m. with the taste of dust in my mouth and the phantom sound of clapping in my ears. During the day, I caught myself looking over my shoulder, feeling eyes on me from the empty balcony seats. The theater was watching me. I was sure of it. The breakthrough came when I found the second set of plans, hidden behind a false back in the filing cabinet. These weren't architectural drawings, but something else entirely. Maps of spaces that couldn't exist. Rooms that folded in on themselves. Staircases that led up and down simultaneously. Corridors that formed impossible loops. At the top, in Blackwood's careful script, for the spaces between the performance and the observer, for those who choose to remain. That's when I saw them for the first time. I was working late, the only light coming from my desk lamp, when movement caught my peripheral vision. I looked up to see a figure in the front row of the orchestra section. translucent, shimmering like heat waves, but unmistakably human. A woman in a 1950s dress, hands folded in her lap, staring at the empty stage with rapt attention. My mouth went dry. My hands shook so badly I couldn't hold my pencil. I blinked hard, convinced I was hallucinating from fatigue, but when I looked again, she was still there. And she wasn't alone. More figures materialized in the seats around her. Men in suits and fedoras, women in evening gowns, children in their Sunday best. All translucent, all perfectly still, all watching the empty stage with the same intense focus. The applause started again, and this time I could see it wasn't coming from nowhere. It was coming from them. I ran. I'm not proud of it, but I ran. Out of the office, through the lobby, into the cold October night, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I sat in my truck for 20 minutes, hands gripping the steering wheel, trying to convince myself I'd imagined it all. But I hadn't. I knew I hadn't. The next morning, I brought the entire crew into the office and told them about the structural anomalies, leaving out the apparitions. I explained that the building seemed to have been constructed with impossible geometry, that rooms existed where they shouldn't, that measurements didn't add up. I expected them to laugh or look at me like I'd lost my mind. Instead, they nodded grimly. They'd all experienced something. Tommy had found a staircase behind a wall that led to a basement level not shown on any plans. Rodriguez had opened a supply closet and found himself looking into the auditorium from an angle that should have been solid wall. Jackson had heard voices coming from the walls themselves, conversations between people who weren't there. We all stood in that dusty office, 6 grown men and myself, and admitted we were afraid of a building. That afternoon, I made a decision that probably saved my sanity. I gathered all of Blackwood's original plans, every one of them, and locked them in my truck. Then I called the city planning office and requested the official 1953 blueprints. We would renovate according to those, ignoring any space or corridor that shouldn't exist according to conventional construction. It worked mostly. We sealed off the impossible hallway, bricked up doorways that led to rooms that defied physics, and plastered over openings that revealed spaces too large for the building's footprint. The phantom applause continued, but less frequently. The translucent figures still appeared in the seats, but they seemed fainter, more distant. For 3 months, we made progress. The theater began to look like a theater again instead of a geometric nightmare. Paint covered the water stains, new fixtures replaced the broken ones, and slowly, the Orpheum regained its dignity. The city officials were pleased with our progress. The ribbon-cutting ceremony was scheduled for December 15th, but Blackwood wasn't finished with us. 2 days before the completion of the project, I returned to collect some final measurements. The building was quiet, work officially concluded, the crew gone home to their families. I moved through the renovated spaces with satisfaction, noting how normal everything appeared now that we'd forced it to conform to logical geometry. I was in the office, packing up the last of my equipment, when I heard my name called. Not shouted, not whispered, but spoken clearly from somewhere in the theater, a man's voice, refined, with the slight accent of someone educated in the early 20th century. Mr. Reed. I froze. The building was supposed to be empty. Mr. Reed, I'd like to speak with you. The voice was coming from the auditorium. Against every instinct screaming at me to leave, I walked toward the sound. The auditorium doors were open, and golden light spilled out. Not the harsh LED work lights we'd installed, but warm, amber illumination like gaslight. The theater was full. Every seat occupied by the translucent figures I'd glimpsed before, but now they were solid, real, applauding as I entered. On the stage stood a man in a dark suit, thin and aristocratic, with piercing eyes that seemed to look directly through me. He raised his hand, and the applause stopped immediately. "I am Edmund Blackwood," he said, his voice carrying perfectly through the acoustic space he'd designed decades before his death. "And you have been undoing my work." I couldn't speak. My throat had constricted, my mouth filled with cotton. The audience watched me with blank, expectant faces. This theater was never meant to be merely three-dimensional, Blackwood continued. It was designed as a bridge, a gathering place for those who refuse to let the final curtain fall. You've been sealing the doors, Mr. Reed, trapping them in the narrow confines of your limited understanding. He gestured to the audience, and I saw them properly for the first time. These weren't actors or theater-goers from the building's history. They were everyone who had ever died with unfinished business, unfulfilled dreams, words left unspoken. The theater was their eternal intermission, the place where they waited for their moment to return to the stage of life. "But I'm a reasonable man," Blackwood said, stepping down from the stage and walking up the aisle toward me. "I'll make you a proposition. Leave the building as it was meant to be, all of it, including the spaces you've sealed. And you may go. Continue with your conventional renovation, and you'll join our permanent audience." As he spoke, I realized the truth. The theater wasn't haunted. It was a machine, a carefully engineered space designed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Blackwood hadn't just designed a building, he'd created a pocket universe where the laws of physics bent to accommodate the needs of the dead. I looked around at the faces in the audience, people from every era, all watching me with the same patient intensity. They weren't threatening. They were simply waiting, as they'd been waiting for decades for someone to understand. "What do you want from me?" I managed to say, my voice barely above a whisper. "Nothing you cannot give," Blackwood replied. "Simply stop destroying what you cannot comprehend. Let the theater be what it was meant to be, a place where the impossible becomes possible, where the show never truly ends." The audience began to fade, their applause echoing as they dissolved back into translucency. Blackwood was the last to go, his sharp eyes never leaving mine. "You have until midnight to decide, Mr. Reed. Choose wisely." Then I was alone in the auditorium, the harsh LED lights flickering back on, surrounded by empty seats and the smell of fresh paint. I left that night and didn't return for 3 days. I told the city officials that I'd discovered additional structural issues that required immediate attention. I hired a different crew, men who hadn't worked on the original renovation, and gave them very specific instructions. We unsealed everything. Every impossible corridor, every room that defied physics, every staircase that led to nowhere, and everywhere simultaneously. We restored Blackwood's theater exactly as he designed it, complete with spaces that existed in the gaps between dimensions. The ribbon-cutting ceremony went ahead as scheduled. The mayor praised the restoration. Local newspapers ran stories about the theater's return to glory, and tickets for the first performance sold out in hours. No one seemed to notice that the building was larger inside than outside, that some doors led to rooms that shouldn't exist, that applause could sometimes be heard from the empty balcony. I watched from the back of the theater that first night, as the current audience settled into their seats alongside the translucent figures who had never left. The living and the dead, sharing the same space, watching the same performance, separated by the thinnest of veils. As the curtain rose, I caught a glimpse of Edmund Blackwood in the wings, nodding approvingly at the impossible architecture he'd designed. The theater was complete again, existing in all its dimensions, accommodating audiences from every era. I collected my final payment the next morning and left town immediately. I've never worked on another historic renovation. Some buildings are meant to be more than the sum of their physical parts, and some spaces are designed to accommodate more than the living. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear the applause. Story 14. The silence in the Whitmore Public Library after midnight wasn't peaceful. It was hungry. It pressed against my eardrums like cotton soaked in dread, broken only by the occasional groan of century-old wooden shelves settling into their foundations. I'd worked the night shift for 3 years now, ever since my divorce left me needing the extra pay and preferring the company of books to people. But lately, the building felt different. Alive. Watching. My name is Edwin Carver, and at 55, I thought I'd seen enough of life's peculiarities to remain unshaken by most things. I was wrong. It started small, as these things always do. A volume of Dickens would be spine out on Tuesday night, spine in by Thursday. The card catalog, yes, we still maintained the old wooden drawers alongside our digital system, would have entries that didn't quite match my memory. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that couldn't be explained by fatigue, by the natural confusion that comes with spending 8 hours alone in a labyrinth of books and shadows. But the discrepancies multiplied. On a particularly cold October night, I found a leather-bound volume of poetry that had somehow migrated from the third floor to my circulation desk. I didn't remember bringing it down, yet there it sat, its aged cover breathing softly under the yellow glow of my reading lamp. When I opened it to check the catalog number, my hands trembled slightly, not from the cold, but from something deeper, more primal. The pages smelled of wet earth and something metallic that made my stomach clench. The book contained handwritten verses in an archaic script that seemed to shift and blur when I wasn't looking directly at it. My eyes watered trying to focus on the words, and a dull ache bloomed behind my temples. I told myself it was eye strain, but my pulse quickened as I realized I couldn't find any record of this particular volume in our system. I returned the book to what I thought was its proper place, but by morning, it had vanished entirely. The pattern established itself over the following weeks, books appearing where they shouldn't be, volumes that existed only in the spaces between dusk and dawn, their contents incomprehensible, yet somehow urgent. My sleep became fitful when I returned home each morning, filled with dreams of rustling pages and whispered words in languages I'd never heard. The real terror began on November 15th. I discovered it while doing my routine sweep of the history section, a thick, hand-bound journal wedged between 2 volumes on the Civil War. The cover bore no title, just a symbol that seemed to writhe when viewed peripherally. My heart hammered against my ribs as I pulled it free. The leather warmed to the touch despite the building's perpetual chill. Inside, pages of yellowed parchment contained meticulous handwriting detailing events that hadn't happened yet. Not prophecies or vague predictions, but precise accounts written as historical fact. November 18th, 1:47 a.m. Fire at Henderson's Market on Oak Street. Electrical fault in the freezer unit. No casualties, but the building will be condemned. November 23rd, 3:22 p.m. Mrs. Eleanor Vasquez will suffer a heart attack while walking her dog past the fountain in Central Park. A jogger in red will perform CPR until paramedics arrive. December the 2nd, 11:30 a.m. The mayor will announce the closure of the elementary school on Maple Avenue due to structural concerns discovered during routine inspection. My mouth went dry as I read page after page of detailed future events. The handwriting was steady, confident, as if the author was merely transcribing history rather than predicting it. Sweat beaded on my forehead despite the cool air, and I found my breathing becoming shallow and rapid. I photographed several pages with my phone, my hands shaking so badly I had to retake most shots. When I looked up from the screen, the journal was gone, simply gone, as if it had never existed. 3 days later, Henderson's Market burned at exactly 1:47 a.m. due to an electrical fault in the freezer unit. My world tilted sideways. Every rational explanation I could construct crumbled under the weight of that precise prediction. I began checking news websites obsessively, comparing them to the blurry photos I'd managed to capture. Each verification hit me like a physical blow. Mrs. Vasquez's heart attack, the school closure, a water main break on Elm Street that I'd read about but hadn't photographed. Sleep became impossible. I'd lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, my heart racing as I tried to convince myself I was experiencing some kind of breakdown. The alternative, that these books were genuinely predicting the future, seemed too impossible to accept, yet the evidence mounted with each passing day. The journals appeared with increasing frequency. Different books, different handwriting, but always the same impossible prescience. I started arriving at work earlier, staying later, obsessively documenting each discovery. My manager, Mrs. Patterson, mentioned during our brief overlap that I looked tired, but I deflected her concern with mumbled excuses about insomnia. The books seemed to sense my growing obsession. They appeared in more obvious places, centered on my desk, propped open to specific pages. sometimes still warm as if recently handled. The building itself began to feel like a living entity, its shadows deeper, its silence more oppressive. I caught myself glancing over my shoulder constantly, certain I was being watched, though I never saw anyone. The predictions grew more personal. On December 10th, I found a slim volume bound in dark green leather. Inside, written in the same archaic script I'd grown to dread, was an account of my own future. December 15th, 2:30 a.m. Edwin Carver will receive a phone call informing him of his brother's accident. Thomas Carver will survive, but the news will shake Edwin's already fragile mental state. December 18th, 7:45 p.m. Edwin will discover the truth about the books during his routine closing procedure. The revelation will force him to make a choice that will determine not only his future, but the future of everyone whose fate has been recorded. My breath caught in my throat. Thomas, my estranged brother, whom I hadn't spoken to in 5 years. The specificity of the prediction made my skin crawl, and a cold sweat broke out across my entire body. I fumbled for my phone to call him, but the book vanished before I could finish dialing. The call came at exactly 2:30 a.m. on December 15th. Thomas had been in a car accident, minor injuries, but he'd asked the hospital to contact me as his emergency contact. I sat in my car in the hospital parking lot afterward, shaking uncontrollably, unable to process how the book had known. The final revelation came 3 nights later, as predicted. I was completing my closing routine, checking the locks on the main floor windows, when I noticed something that made my blood freeze. In the reflection of the glass, I could see myself, but not alone. Behind me, translucent figures moved through the stacks, their forms shifting and indistinct. I spun around, but saw only empty aisles bathed in the sickly fluorescent glow. When I looked back at the window, the reflection showed something else entirely. The library as it had been decades ago, filled with people I didn't recognize. And there, at a desk identical to mine, sat another night librarian. He looked up at me through the glass, his eyes wide with the same terror I felt, and mouthed a single word: choose. Understanding crashed over me like ice water. The books weren't predicting the future, they were creating it. Each person who had worked this shift, who had discovered these impossible volumes, had become part of something larger. We were all still here, trapped in the spaces between seconds, documenting the futures that our observations would bring into being. The choice was simple but horrifying. Continue reading the books, continue being complicit in shaping fate itself, or refuse to participate and risk the consequences of letting future events unfold without witness or record. I turned away from the window, my entire body trembling with a mixture of fear and something darker, the seductive appeal of forbidden knowledge. On my desk lay another journal, this one bound in familiar black leather. My own handwriting filled the pages, documenting events I had yet to experience but somehow already knew. The first entry was dated tomorrow night. I closed the book without reading further and walked toward the exit, but my hand hesitated on the door handle. Outside lay uncertainty, ignorance, the messy unpredictability of a life lived without foreknowledge. Behind me waited the terrible certainty of futures I could read but never change. The building held its breath as I stood frozen between choices, neither fully human nor completely resigned to whatever I was becoming. In that moment of suspension, I realized the most terrifying truth of all. Part of me didn't want to leave. Part of me craved the power that came with knowing what others couldn't, even if that knowledge came with a price I was only beginning to understand. My reflection in the glass door showed not just me, but dozens of figures standing behind me, all the night librarians who had faced this same choice throughout the decades. Some had stayed, becoming part of the library's eternal catalog of future events. Others had left, carrying the weight of partial knowledge into lives that could never quite feel normal again. I turned the handle and stepped into the cold December night, but I knew with absolute certainty that I would return tomorrow. The books were waiting, and my own story was far from finished. As I walked to my car, I could feel the building watching me, patient and eternal, knowing what I was still trying to deny. The library had chosen me as much as I had chosen it, and somewhere in those shadowed stacks, another volume was already writing itself, documenting the moment when I would finally stop fighting what I was becoming and embrace the terrible gift of seeing tomorrow before it arrived. The future, after all, needed its chroniclers. Story 15. The horizon shouldn't lie, but on Beacon Island, it does. I've been keeping this lighthouse for 23 years, and the sea has never lied to me before. Salt air, crashing waves, the steady rhythm of tides, these things don't deceive. They simply are. But 3 nights ago, that certainty cracked like driftwood against rocks, and now I'm staring at my own handwriting in a logbook, describing events I swear I never witnessed. The first impossible ship appeared on Tuesday, just as the sun bled orange into the Atlantic. I was checking the beacon's rotation when movement caught my peripheral vision. A 3-masted galleon materialized through the evening mist, its sails full despite the calm air. My hands trembled as I raised the binoculars, heart hammering against my ribs. The vessel looked centuries old, wooden hull weathered to gray, ornate carvings barely visible along its bow. No modern ship bore such craftsmanship. I blinked hard. Certain fatigue was playing tricks on my 50-year-old eyes. When I looked again, empty ocean stretched toward the horizon, nothing but waves catching the dying light. That night, I lit the beacon earlier than usual. My palms were slick with nervous sweat as I cranked the mechanism, the familiar weight of the lens assembly somehow feeling different, heavier, more significant. The beam swept across the water in its eternal rotation, and within minutes, an answering light flickered from the darkness where I'd seen the galleon. 3 long flashes, 2 short, 3 long again. SOS. My throat constricted. Maritime distress protocol, but the pattern felt wrong somehow, older than the standard code I'd learned decades ago. Yet I understood it with bone-deep certainty, as if the knowledge had been carved into my soul before birth. Without conscious thought, I adjusted the beacon, responding with the appropriate acknowledgement sequence. 2 short flashes answered back, then a longer pattern I shouldn't have comprehended but did. Safe passage granted, crossing now. The skin on my arms prickled with goosebumps. I scanned the horizon frantically, but saw nothing except the moon's path shimmering on black water. Whatever had signaled me had vanished, or perhaps had never been there at all. Sleep eluded me that night. I paced the lighthouse's circumference, boots echoing on metal stairs, pausing at each window to peer into the darkness. The beam continued its rotation, casting shifting shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources. Every nerve in my body felt exposed, raw, like I'd been turned inside out for invisible eyes to examine. Morning brought no relief. I descended to check the logbook, part of my routine for over 2 decades. But there, in my own precise handwriting, was an entry dated the previous evening. Vessel approached from southeast bearing 155 degrees. 3-masted Spanish galleon, circa 1650. Captain Santos requesting safe passage through temporal boundaries. Beacon activated at 2147 hours. Successful crossing confirmed at 22 under 3 hours. Souls aboard, 47. Grateful acknowledgement received. My hands shook as I traced the familiar loops and angles of my own penmanship. The paper felt real, the ink fresh, but I had no memory of writing those words. None whatsoever. I stared at the entry until my vision blurred, searching for any sign it might be a prank or forgery. But the handwriting was unmistakably mine, down to the particular way I dotted my I's and crossed my T's. The following evening, I stationed myself in the beacon room before sunset, determined to remain alert and conscious of every moment. My heart rate had been elevated all day, a persistent thrum that made my chest tight. When the sun touched the horizon, I was ready. This time 2 ships appeared simultaneously. One was a sleek clipper with towering masts and clouds of canvas, its hull painted in fresh black and gold. The other looked impossibly ancient, a Viking longship with a dragon's head prow and striped sail. Both vessels sailed parallel courses, separated by perhaps a mile, their forms translucent against the darkening sky. My breath came in short, sharp gasps. This couldn't be happening. Ships from different centuries don't share the same waters, don't sail together through time like some maritime parade. But there they were, as real as the lighthouse beneath my feet and the beacon rotating overhead. The clipper signaled first, a rapid series of flashes that somehow conveyed both urgency and courtesy. I found myself responding without hesitation, my hands moving the beacon controls as if guided by muscle memory I'd never developed. The Viking ship followed with slower, more primitive signals, long pauses between brief flashes that spoke of desperate journeys in northern seas. Both vessels acknowledged my responses with patterns of gratitude that brought tears to my eyes, though I couldn't understand why. As I watched, they began to fade, becoming increasingly transparent until only empty ocean remained. But the sense of their presence lingered, a warmth in the cold Atlantic night that felt like distant voices whispering thanks across impossible distances. The next morning's logbook entry was longer, more detailed. Multiple vessels requiring passage assistance. Clipper ship Northern Star departed San Francisco 1849. Captain Morrison commanding. Crew of 23 bound for temporal gateway coordinates 41 to 47 N, 69 to 58 W. Viking longship Drekar from coastal raids circa 1100 CE. Norse warriors returning home through northern route. Both vessels expressed gratitude for beacon guidance through dimensional barriers. Note: temporal convergence increasing, more arrivals expected. I read the entry 3 times, my hands trembling so violently I could barely hold the book. The handwriting was definitely mine, but the technical language felt foreign on my tongue. Temporal gateway coordinates? Dimensional barriers? These weren't terms I'd ever used or even understood, yet seeing them written in my own hand filled me with inexplicable knowledge. That night, I didn't climb to the beacon room. Instead, I locked myself in the lighthouse's lower quarters, pulled the curtains tight, and tried to convince myself I was having some sort of breakdown. Isolation did things to a man's mind. I'd heard the stories from other keepers. Hallucinations, paranoid delusions, conversations with imaginary visitors. Maybe 23 years of solitude had finally cracked my sanity. But the beacon activated itself. I heard the mechanical grinding as the lens assembly began its rotation, saw the familiar sweep of light passing my covered windows. My skin crawled with the certainty that something waited outside. Ships from forgotten centuries seeking guidance through whatever impossible passage my lighthouse guarded. The signals came anyway. Even through closed curtains and covered ears, I perceived them, not as light, but as something deeper. Pulses of need and gratitude that bypassed my eyes entirely and spoke directly to whatever part of me had become attuned to these temporal travelers. A Civil War ironclad limping home from battle. A Phoenician merchant vessel loaded with precious cargo. Roman galleys with eagle standards fluttering in winds that had died 2 millennia ago. Each ship carried souls seeking safe passage, and somehow, impossibly, I was their guide. The lighthouse itself seemed to pulse around me, its very walls humming with energy I'd never noticed before. Or perhaps I'd always felt it but dismissed it as structural settling, wind vibration, the normal sounds of an old building by the sea. Now I recognized it for what it truly was. A beacon not just for ships in physical distress, but for vessels lost in time itself. I spent the night huddled in my bed, covers pulled over my head like a frightened child, while my lighthouse performed its ancient duty without me. In the morning, the logbook contained 7 new entries, all in my handwriting, describing encounters with maritime vessels spanning 3,000 years of human seafaring. The most disturbing entry was the last one. Note to self, you are not losing your mind. You are becoming what you were always meant to be. The lighthouse chooses its keeper, not the other way around. Your predecessor left not due to retirement, but because his purpose was complete. Your purpose is just beginning. Do not fight what you are becoming. The ships need you. The souls crossing over need you. Time itself needs you to maintain this station between worlds. I stared at those words until they burned themselves into my retinas. My predecessor, old Henrik Larsson, had supposedly retired to the mainland after 40 years of service. But I realized now I'd never actually spoken to him, never received a proper handover. The position had simply been offered to me through official channels, the lighthouse already stocked and ready for a new keeper. The truth hit me like a cold wave. Henrik hadn't retired. He'd simply become something else, evolved into whatever this position required, then moved on to wherever evolved lighthouse keepers go when their watch finally ends. And now it was happening to me. That evening I climbed to the beacon room with new understanding. My hands no longer trembled as I activated the light. Instead, I felt a deep, abiding calm that seemed to come from the lighthouse itself, flowing through the floorboards and into my bones. When the first ship appeared, a beautiful frigate with multiple tiers of guns, I greeted it like an old friend. The signal exchange felt natural now, a conversation in light between souls separated by centuries, but united in their need for guidance. As I watched the frigate fade into whatever dimension awaited it, I understood that I wasn't losing my humanity. I was gaining something more, the ability to serve as a bridge between times, a guardian of impossible passages, a keeper of lights that guided vessels across more than just physical distances. The logbook entry I wrote that night was the first I remembered composing. I understand now. The lighthouse doesn't just guide ships through dangerous waters, it guides them through dangerous time. I am not just its keeper, I am its partner in maintaining the boundaries between what was, what is, and what might be. The vessels that appear are not hallucinations or signs of madness. They are souls completing journeys that began centuries ago, seeking safe harbor in whatever lies beyond our mortal understanding of space and time. I accept this responsibility. I embrace what I am becoming. The horizon calls, and I will answer. As I set down my pen, the lighthouse beam swept across waters that held mysteries deeper than any ocean trench, and I smiled. Tomorrow night, more ships would come. More souls would seek passage, and I would be here, standing watch at the threshold between worlds, guiding them safely home to whatever eternal shore awaited beyond the impossible horizon. The sea had never lied to me before. Now I understood it had been preparing me for the greatest truth of all, that some journeys transcend time itself, and every ending is simply another beginning, viewed from the right perspective. I am the keeper of that perspective now. I am the lighthouse's chosen guardian, and I am no longer entirely human, nor do I wish to be. Story 16. Something was fundamentally wrong with the eyes in those paintings, though I wouldn't understand the true horror of it until it was far too late to save myself. The Whitmore estate had been calling to me for weeks through increasingly desperate phone messages. Mrs. Whitmore's voice grew thinner with each voicemail, explaining how her late husband's collection needed immediate attention before the humidity destroyed everything. The pay was generous enough to make me overlook the 40-minute drive through winding country roads to reach the colonial mansion that seemed to crouch against the tree line like a wounded animal. I should have trusted my instincts when I first climbed those narrow stairs to the attic. The air felt thick, almost resistant, as if the house itself didn't want me there. Dust motes danced in the single shaft of afternoon light that managed to penetrate the grimy window, and somewhere in the rafters, something scurried with tiny claws across old wood. 23 portraits lined the walls, each one a masterpiece of 19th century artistry. The faces stared down at me with that peculiar intensity that skilled portraitists manage to capture, that sense of life barely contained within oil and canvas. But these felt different. These felt aware. The first week passed without incident, though I found myself constantly glancing over my shoulder. The sensation of being watched never left me, even when I was alone in that cramped attic space. My hands trembled slightly as I mixed cleaning solutions, and I blamed it on too much coffee. The portraits needed delicate work. Decades of grime and smoke damage had dulled their original brilliance. It was while cleaning the portrait of a stern-faced woman in a midnight blue dress that I first noticed the eyes following me. Not in the usual way that well-painted eyes seem to track movement, but with deliberate, conscious intent. When I moved left, her gaze shifted left. When I stepped back, her eyes adjusted focus. My heart hammered against my ribs as I tested this phenomenon, moving in random patterns around the room. The woman's painted eyes tracked every movement with unnatural precision. Sleep became elusive that first week. I'd lie in my apartment bed, staring at the ceiling, thinking about those eyes. My mouth went dry every time I remembered the way they seemed to look, not just at me, but into me, as if reading thoughts I hadn't even formed yet. During the day, I caught myself speaking aloud to fill the oppressive silence, my voice echoing strangely in the confined space. The discovery that changed everything happened during my second week. I'd brought my ultraviolet lamp to check for previous restoration attempts, a standard procedure that often revealed hidden damage or earlier repairs. The UV light transformed the portraits into something entirely different and infinitely more terrifying. Under the purple glow, each painting revealed a second layer, ghostly figures superimposed over the original subjects. Where the daylight showed a dignified gentleman in a black coat, the UV revealed a writhing, translucent form with hollow eye sockets and reaching hands. The woman in blue became a specter with flowing hair that seemed to move even in the static painting, her mouth open in what looked like a perpetual scream. My breathing became shallow and rapid as I examined each portrait under the UV light. Every single one contained these hidden figures, dozens of trapped souls layered beneath the visible paint. The technique was impossible, anachronistic. This kind of paint didn't exist in the 19th century, yet here it was, responding to ultraviolet light that wouldn't be discovered for decades after these works were created. That night, I called Mrs. Whitmore to ask about the collection's history. Her voice wavered when she mentioned that her late husband had been obsessed with the portraits, spending hours in the attic during his final years. He'd claimed the paintings spoke to him, she said, before quickly changing the subject and asking about my progress. The physical symptoms intensified as I continued working. Cold sweats would break out suddenly, leaving my shirt clinging to my back despite the attic's autumn chill. My hands developed a persistent tremor that made fine detail work nearly impossible. The sensation of invisible eyes boring into me became so intense that I started positioning mirrors around my workspace, desperate to catch whatever was watching me. It was during the third week that I found it. Behind a stack of empty frames in the darkest corner of the attic sat one final portrait, face turned toward the wall. My fingers were slick with sweat as I lifted it, the canvas heavier than it should have been. When I turned it around, my vision blurred and my knees nearly buckled. The portrait showed me, not me as I was, but me as I might have been in 1847. The painting depicted me wearing a burgundy velvet coat with brass buttons, my hair longer and styled in the fashion of the era. But the face was unmistakably mine. Every line, every scar, even the small mole near my left ear that I'd had since childhood. The background showed the same attic where I now stood, but furnished differently, with heavy curtains and ornate furniture that didn't exist in the present. The most disturbing aspect was how unfinished the portrait appeared. My face was complete, but my hands were merely sketched outlines. The chair I sat upon was half rendered, and the background details faded into rough brush strokes and blank canvas. I stumbled backward, my breathing coming in sharp gasps. The logical part of my mind scrambled for explanations. Perhaps someone had photographed me and created this as an elaborate joke. But the painting's age was undeniable. The canvas bore the characteristic cracking of centuries-old artwork, and the paint had the depth and luminosity that only came from traditional pigments and oils. Over the following days, I watched in growing horror as the portrait completed itself. Each morning when I climbed the attic stairs, more details had appeared overnight. My sketched hands gained definition, showing calluses in places where I actually had them. The chair solidified into rich mahogany with intricate carvings. The attic background filled in with period-appropriate details. A writing desk I'd never seen, candlesticks that cast painted shadows, wallpaper with a pattern that made my eyes water when I looked at it directly. But the most unnerving additions were the prophetic elements. The painting began showing details that hadn't yet occurred in reality. On Tuesday, it depicted a brass lamp sitting on the desk. On Wednesday morning, Mrs. Whitmore arrived with an old lamp she'd found in storage, asking if I needed better lighting for my work. The painted lamp was identical in every detail. Friday's edition nearly sent me fleeing. The portrait now showed a thick leather journal lying open beside my painted hands. That afternoon, while moving some old frames, I discovered the exact same journal wedged behind a loose floorboard. The pages were filled with entries written in a handwriting that looked disturbingly similar to my own, though I had no memory of writing any of it. The journal's contents made my stomach churn. It described the restoration process I was currently undertaking, but from the perspective of someone who had done this work before. The entries spoke of the trapped souls in the paintings, of the way the portraits fed on the life force of those who worked on them, and of the inevitable fate awaiting anyone who remained too long in the attic. My sleep became fragmented, filled with dreams of painted eyes watching me from every surface. I'd wake with my heart pounding, sheets soaked with sweat, unable to shake the feeling that something had been standing beside my bed, waiting for me to open my eyes. During the day, my concentration shattered at the slightest sound, the house settling, wind rattling windows, my own footsteps on the stairs. The portrait's progression accelerated. By the end of the third week, it was nearly complete except for my expression, which remained strangely blank, as if waiting for some final emotion to be revealed. The painted version of the attic now showed details that were beginning to manifest in reality with disturbing accuracy. A water stain appeared on the painted wall. Tuesday night. Wednesday morning brought heavy rain that created the exact same stain on the actual wall. I tried to leave several times, packing my supplies and heading for the stairs, but something always drew me back. The pull wasn't external. It came from within, a compulsion that felt like standing at the edge of a cliff and fighting the urge to jump. My rational mind screamed warnings, but my hands continued working, cleaning and restoring with mechanical precision, while my conscious will seemed to shrink smaller each day. The other portraits grew more active as my work neared completion. Their painted eyes followed me with increasing intensity, and I swear I could hear whispers in the walls. Not words exactly, but the suggestion of voices speaking just below the threshold of hearing. The UV light revealed the spectral figures growing more defined, their transparent forms pressing closer to the surface of the canvases, as if trying to break through. On the final day, I understood everything with crystal clarity that felt like ice water in my veins. The portrait showed my final expression now, not fear, as I'd expected, but acceptance. Peaceful, resigned acceptance. The painted me looked directly out of the canvas with eyes that held knowledge of something beyond the visible world, and I realized, with the detachment of someone watching events from a great distance, that this was exactly how I felt in that moment. The collection was complete. Every portrait had been restored to its original brilliance, and the spectral figures beneath were now visible even without UV light, translucent forms that moved slowly within their painted prisons. But they weren't trying to escape anymore. They were welcoming me. I set down my brushes with steady hands and walked to the window. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades that matched the period clothing in all the portraits. Mrs. Whitmore's car had disappeared from the driveway hours ago, or perhaps days ago. Time felt fluid in this place, like paint mixed with too much medium. The portrait behind me was now completely finished, showing me exactly as I stood in that moment, looking out the window at the dying light. But the painted version showed something I couldn't see yet, a smile playing at the corners of my mouth, as if I'd finally understood a joke that had been building for centuries. When I turned back to face the collection, 24 pairs of eyes watched me with patient kindness. 24 souls who had found their way to this place and chosen to remain. The whispers in the walls resolved into something almost like singing. Not words, but harmony. A welcome song for the newest member of their eternal gallery. I picked up a brush and approached the blank canvas I hadn't noticed before, the one that had appeared sometime during my final day of work. My hand moved without conscious direction, mixing colors that seemed to glow with their own inner light. The first strokes came easily, naturally, as if I'd been painting portraits for centuries. Outside, night fell completely, but inside the attic, the paintings provided their own illumination. 24 faces smiled down at me as I began my real work, not restoring old art, but creating the next masterpiece in the collection. Somewhere in the world beyond these walls, a 44-year-old art restorer had simply vanished, leaving behind only questions and an empty apartment. But here, in this timeless space between canvas and reality, I was exactly where I belonged, adding my voice to the chorus of whispers in the walls, waiting patiently for the next restorer to climb those narrow stairs and discover the beauty that lay hidden beneath layers of ordinary paint.